died wrong. It had taken 3 Custodian guardians to corner the thing in the rubble of what had once been the Eternity Wall's eastern bastion. Their guardian spears had carved through its flesh of congealed screams, their auramite armor turning aside claws that could peel through tank plating. They had fought it for 17 minutes by the chronometer in Captain General Constantin Valdor's vambrace. 17 minutes while traitor artillery turned the sky into a bleeding canvas of fire, and the air tasted of promethium and burning bone. The demon had laughed through it all, its voice a chorus of children weeping and glass breaking, because demons always laughed. They knew the secret that kept the Custodians fighting even as Terra burned around them. That killing a demon only sent it back to the warp, that every victory was temporary, that the war could never truly be won. Then the Pale Man had stepped through a tear in reality that wasn't a warp rift, and everything the Custodians knew about the nature of their enemy became a lie. He wore no armor. That was the first impossible thing. His skin was ash gray, marked with fading red tattoos that looked like old burn scars, and he moved through the demon's flailing limbs with the economy of something that had killed so many times that violence had become a language more fluent than speech. He carried 2 blades, neither of which registered on any Auspex spectrum the Custodians possessed. One blazed with flames that seemed to burn cold, the other trailed frost that left the air itself cracked and brittle. The demon turned its multitude of eyes upon him and smiled with too many mouths. It spoke his name, Kratos. The Pale Man said nothing. He never said anything. He simply moved. What happened next would be reported to Rogal Dorn within the hour, and the Praetorian of Terra would read the account 3 times before he believed it. The Pale Man's blades carved through the demon's essence, and where they cut, the wound did not close. The creature's flesh did not knit back together or dissolve into warp stuff to reform elsewhere. It bled, not blood, but something deeper than blood, something that looked like liquid starlight mixed with all the colors that shouldn't exist. The demon screamed, and it was not the scream of something returning to the immaterium to be reborn. It was the scream of something dying truly, permanently, impossibly. When it was over, the demon's corpse remained. A corpse. Not dissipating essence, not fading laughter, but actual dead matter cooling on the shattered rockcrete. The Custodians stood in silence, their guardian spears still raised, watching the Pale Man clean his blades on a strip of torn cloth that might once have been part of a company standard. Valdor himself arrived 4 minutes later, descending from a Coronis grav carrier with a full complement of the Legio Custodes' finest. He had been coordinating the defense of the Ultimate Gate when the Vox report reached him. He had not believed it. He believed in the Emperor, in the Primarchs, in the fundamental laws that governed existence, even in this age of madness and betrayal. He did not believe in impossibilities. The Pale Man stood amid the rubble, looking up at the sky where traitor ships burned in low orbit, and the distant shape of the vengeful spirit hung like a cancerous moon. He did not acknowledge the Custodians surrounding him with weapons drawn. He simply stared upward, and there was something in his expression that Valdor, who had stood at the Emperor's side since before the Unification Wars, recognized instantly. It was the look of a man who had already killed his gods once before, and was measuring the ones here to see if they would die the same way. "Your name," Valdor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority that even Primarchs had learned to respect. "Your allegiance. Your purpose on Terra." The Pale Man's gaze dropped from the sky to meet Valdor's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was a low rasp, the sound of millstones grinding bone to dust. "I am Kratos. I serve no master, and I am here because I followed the screaming." Behind them, another barrage of traitor artillery struck the outer walls. Closer now, always closer. The War Master's forces had been grinding forward for weeks, and every day brought them nearer to the inner palace, nearer to the Sanctum Imperialis, nearer to the Golden Throne where the Emperor of Mankind fought a war in two realities at once. Terra was dying by degrees, and the Custodians were running out of time, out of soldiers, out of miracles. Valdor looked at the demon's corpse again, at the wounds that had not closed, at the death that should not be possible. "You will come with us," he said. "The Praetorian will want to speak with you." Kratos nodded once. As he walked past the Custodians, one of them, a guardian who had served for 2 centuries and seen horrors that would break lesser minds, noticed something that made his blood run cold, despite all his conditioning. The pale man's shadow fell across the demon's corpse, and where the shadow touched, the warp essence still leaking from the wounds began to evaporate like morning dew under a merciless sun. Somewhere deep in the webway, in the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace where the Emperor's greatest work had become his greatest failure, something vast and terrible felt a disturbance. The Chaos Gods, bloated on the suffering of the heresy, turned a fraction of their infinite attention toward Terra, toward the pale figure walking through the ruins of Eternity Wall, and for the first time since the Horus Heresy began, they felt something they had not felt in eons. They felt concerned. The screaming rift through which Kratos had arrived collapsed with a sound like 1,000 windows shattering in reverse, and in the sudden silence that followed, Valdor realized he had not asked the most important question of all. How does one kill what cannot die? And what does it cost to learn that answer? Terra would find out. The galaxy would find out. And before the siege was over, the very nature of reality itself would be forced to provide an answer written in the ashes of gods. Rogal Dorn stood before the hololith projector in the Barb Bastion Command Center and studied the impossible with the same methodical precision he applied to fortress architecture. The 3-dimensional image rotated slowly, showing the demon's corpse from 17 different angles captured by Custodian helmet recorders. Medical servitors had attempted to autopsy the remains. Their instruments had failed, not malfunctioned, failed, as though the concept of measurement itself rejected what lay on the examination slab. "It has been 6 hours, Dorn said, his voice carrying the flat certainty that had earned him the title of Praetorian. "The corpse has not degraded. It has not dissolved. Standard warp-taint protocols show negligible corruption. By every law we understand, this should not exist." Kratos stood 15 feet away, flanked by 4 custodians, whose guardian spears remained a hand's breadth from combat activation. He had not moved since being brought to the command center. He had not asked for water, for food, for explanation. He simply waited with the patience of stone worn smooth by centuries of rain. Valdor stood between them, his auramite armor still bearing scorch marks from the morning's fighting. The stranger's blades register no energy signature. They are not power weapons. They are not force weapons. They are not archaeotech we recognize. Yet they killed what we have spent 10,000 years learning cannot be killed. Dorn turned away from the hololith. His face, carved from the same granite as his fortresses, showed no emotion. He had not slept in 4 days. None of them had. Sleep was a luxury Terra could no longer afford. "Explain your weapons." Kratos's gaze remained steady. "They were forged to kill gods." "There are no gods," Dorn said immediately. It was doctrine. It was the imperial truth that the Emperor himself had preached across the galaxy. There are only beings of great power. The warp entities you call demons are parasites of human emotion given form. Powerful, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But not divine, not unkillable. "You believe that?" Kratos asked. The question hung in the recycled air of the command center. Outside, the void shields flickered under renewed bombardment. The walls shuddered. Somewhere in the distance, a munitions depot detonated with a roar that rattled the reinforced glass of the viewing ports. "I believe in what can be proven," Dorn replied. "I believe in mathematics, in structure, in the strength of well-laid stone and the weakness of poorly calculated angles of fire. I believe my father created the Imperium through will and science, not through worship of primitive superstition." Kratos reached for his belt. 8 custodians moved instantly, weapons rising. He froze, then slowly drew forth a small object and placed it on the steel table between them. It was a carved piece of stone, worn smooth by handling, depicting a woman and a child. "I had a family once," Kratos said. "The gods of my world made me kill them. They used my rage, my pride, my desperation. They made me their weapon, their slave, their entertainment. So I learned to kill them, one by one. I climbed from the depths of their underworld to the heights of their mountain. I tore down their temples. I broke their bodies. I ended their immortality with these blades, and with this." He tapped his chest over his heart. "With the understanding that anything that can bleed can die. Anything that can want can be denied. Anything that feeds on worship can be starved." Dorn stepped closer. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists towered over Kratos, gene-enhanced might made manifest. Yet something in the pale man's stillness suggested that height mattered less than men believed. "You claim to have killed gods, plural, and you arrived on Terra through a rift that was not warp-based. How?" "I destroyed the world that made me a monster," Kratos said. "When the last god fell, when the last thread of fate was cut, the void between worlds opened. I fell through places without names. I heard screaming, endless screaming, the voices of billions burning in a fire that never consumes. I followed that sound because I know what it means when gods feed on suffering. I know what it looks like when the powerful devour the weak and call it divine right." Valdor's vox bead chimed. He listened for 3 seconds, his expression unchanging, then spoke. "Lord Dorn, the War Master's forces have breached the Mercury Wall. Lord Sanguinius requests immediate reinforcement at the Gorgon Bar. Estimated time until they reach the Sanctum Imperialis has decreased to 72 hours. 72 hours, 3 days. That was all Terra had left before Horus stood at the gates of the inner palace, before the traitor Primarchs could focus their full might on the final stronghold, before the Emperor would be forced to leave the Golden Throne and the Webway War to confront his fallen son directly. Dorn's jaw tightened. It was the only sign of emotion he allowed himself. Casualties: 14,000 Imperial Fists, 9,000 Imperial Army Regulars, 3 Legio Titanicus engines, 2 Custodians. Valdor's voice carried no inflection. The numbers were simply data. The dead were simply facts. "We are running out of men, my lord. We are running out of time." The Praetorian turned back to Kratos. For a long moment, he said nothing. Rogal Dorn was not a man given to leaps of faith. He built his strategies on tested principles, on known strengths and calculated risks. But he was also the son of the Emperor, and he had learned from his father that sometimes the galaxy presented problems that could not be solved with conventional tools. "You kill what should not die," Dorn said slowly. "You claim expertise in ending gods. Very well. I have a question for you, and Terra's survival may depend on your answer." He gestured to the hololith, which shifted to display the roiling nightmare of the Webway breach beneath the palace. The endless tide of demons pouring through the rift, the Emperor himself barely held closed. The warp entities draw power from human emotion across the galaxy. They are sustained by the immaterium itself, by a dimension of pure psychic energy that has existed since before mankind's birth. They cannot be permanently killed because they are not truly alive. They are concepts given teeth. "Everything can be killed," Kratos said. "Can you kill the warp itself?" The question fell like a hammer on an anvil. Even Valdor turned sharply to stare at his Primarch. The notion was madness. The warp was reality's foundation, the medium through which human ships traveled between stars, the source of the Astronomican's light that guided navigators through the void. Destroying it would be like destroying gravity, like unmaking light itself. Kratos picked up the carved stone from the table and returned it to his belt. When he looked up at Dorn, there was something in his eyes that the Primarch recognized because he had seen it in his father's gaze during the darkest moments of the Great Crusade. It was the look of a being who had already decided that the impossible was simply a problem waiting for the right application of force. "Show me where it lives," Kratos said. "Show me where it bleeds into your world, and I will show you how to make it stop." Outside, the sky split open with tracer fire and plasma discharge. The War Master's forces pressed closer. The clock counted down to Terra's final hours, and in the depths of the Imperial Palace, in a chamber few living souls had ever seen, preparations began for a mission that should not succeed, led by a man who should not exist, aimed at a target that should not die. Rogal Dorn activated his Vox link to the Mechanicum. "This is the Praetorian. I require immediate consultation with your highest-ranking Magos on Terra. Subject: theoretical xenotech integration, hostile warp space topology, and weapons that violate known physical law. Priority: absolute. Time frame: now." The response came within seconds. "Compliance, Lord Dorn. Archmagos Dominus Kane responds. He asks what you need." Dorn looked at the blades strapped to Kratos' back, at the impossible corpse still lying in the examination chamber, at the man who claimed he had killed gods and seemed entirely too calm about the prospect of doing it again. "I need," Dorn said carefully, "to build something that should not exist." The Mechanicum facility, designated Forge Tertius Obscurus, had been built into the bedrock 3 miles beneath the Imperial Palace, back when the Emperor still believed the Webway project would succeed. Its primary function had been reverse engineering xenotech recovered from compliant worlds, studying alien principles of physics that human science had not yet codified. When the Webway ruptured and demons poured through the breach, the facility had been evacuated in 17 minutes. Most of the tech priests made it out. Most. Kratos descended the access shaft in a cargo lift designed to carry Atlas recovery vehicles, flanked by 4 custodians and Archmagos Dominus Zagreus Kane. The Archmagos was more machine than man, his original flesh reduced to a brain stem and spinal column suspended in sacred oils, his augmented frame bristling with manipulator arms, Auspex arrays, and weapon systems that could reduce a tank to molten slag. His binary cant hummed constantly, a background radiation of data prayer that made the air taste of ozone. "The Praetorian's request violates 14 protocols of the Mechanicum Orthodoxy," Kane said. His Vox unit modulated to approximate human speech patterns, but never quite achieving them. "Integrating unknown xenotech with weapons of uncertain providence. Attempting theoretical manipulation of warp space topology without adequate testing. Operating under combat conditions with insufficient safety margins. I calculate a 73% probability of catastrophic failure." "And the other 27%? Kratos asked. Kane's optical sensors focused on him with the clicking precision of targeting locks. "Unknown. Your weapons exist outside our understanding of materium-based physics. They killed a warp entity permanently, which suggests either an exotic particle interaction we cannot detect, or they operate on principles so far removed from standard science that our instruments are inadequate to measure them. Fascinating, heretical, necessary." The Archmagos' manipulator arms twitched in what might have been the machine equivalent of a shrug. The Omnissiah works in mysterious ways. The lift shuddered to a halt. The doors opened onto darkness so complete it seemed to have texture, a black that pushed back against the lumens on the Custodian's armor. Kratos stepped out first. His boots crunched on something that wasn't rockcrete. When Valdor swept his guardian spear's light across the floor, they saw it was glass. Thousands of shards of shattered glass mixing with frozen pools of what looked like mercury. Except mercury did not whisper in dead languages when disturbed. The facility was compromised during the initial breach, Kane explained, gliding forward on anti-grav repulsors that kept him 6 inches above the corrupted floor. Minor warp incursion, 17 tech priests dead, 643 servitors offline. The contamination spread through the ventilation system before we could seal it. Nothing living should survive here for more than 4 minutes before cognitive degradation begins. How long have we been here? One of the custodians asked. 6 minutes, Kane replied. Curious. Kratos moved deeper into the facility. The darkness retreated reluctantly before their lights, revealing walls that had been pristine Imperial architecture, but now wept fluids that defied chemistry. Machinery that had once hummed with the Mechanicum's careful precision now sat in twisted configurations, their purpose altered by something that understood technology the way a disease understands flesh. Cables hung from the ceiling like entrails. Monitors displayed equations that hurt to look at directly, mathematical proofs of impossible theorems. "This is where reality is thin," Kratos said. It wasn't a question. "Affirmative. The webway breach is 700 meters below us. The Emperor maintains the seal, but his attention is divided across multiple fronts. The barrier weakens daily. The warp presses against our reality here like water against a dam with spreading cracks." Kane led them through corridors that bent at angles architecture should not permit. "What you see around you is what happens when the immaterium touches the materium without proper shielding. Matter remembers things it should not. Time becomes negotiable. Causality becomes a suggestion rather than a law." They passed an examination chamber where servitors hung motionless in their restraint harnesses, their augmetic implants fused with their flesh in configurations that should have killed them, but somehow had not. Their eyes tracked the group's movement with desperate awareness. One of them mouthed words. "Kill us, please. We are still conscious." Valdor raised his guardian spear. Kratos caught his wrist. "No. They are already dead. What remains is just the warp wearing their shapes, learning what it feels like to have a body." He released the custodian's arm. "Burning them only feeds it. Starve it instead. Ignore it. Give it nothing." The servitors' mouths opened wider, until their jaws dislocated and something that looked like black smoke began to pour out. The custodians moved into defensive positions. Kratos kept walking. After a moment, the smoke dissipated, and the servitors went still, and the corridor was just a corridor again, corrupted but stable. "You have experience with such manifestations," Kane observed. "I lived in the underworld for 3 years," Kratos said. "I learned the difference between what wants to be seen and what simply is. One you fight, the other you endure." They reached the primary laboratory at the facility's heart. It was a vast chamber, 300 feet across, its ceiling lost in shadows that might have been structural, or might have been the absence of existence itself. At the center stood an examination platform, surrounded by machinery that hummed with barely contained power. Above it, suspended in a cage of magnetic force, floated a sphere of liquid metal that shifted between solid and fluid states without transition. "Recovered from a tomb world on the eastern fringe," Kane said. "Necron technology," we theorized, though it matches no known design in our archives. It demonstrates properties consistent with what human legends called cold iron, anathema to warp-based entities. The material's atomic structure seems to exist partially outside our dimension, creating a null zone that demons cannot enter. His optical arrays swiveled toward Kratos. "We believe it can be forged. We believe it can be shaped. We have never had a weapon capable of working it, nor a purpose that justified the attempt." Kratos approached the sphere. He could feel it now, the way it pushed against the air around it, creating a pocket of absolute silence in a universe that never stopped screaming. He had felt something similar once, in the deepest chambers of the Titan's prison, where Kronos had stored fragments of primordial chaos before even the Olympian gods existed. "This alone will not be enough," he said. "Correct," Kane replied. "We require a power source, something capable of sustaining a weapon through prolonged exposure to warp space environment, something that can channel sufficient energy to sever the immaterium's connection to our reality." The Archmagos's frame shifted, manipulator arms unfolding to gesture at consoles displaying calculations that scrolled faster than human eyes could track. "I have run 14,000 simulations. None succeed. The warp is infinite. It is a dimension unto itself. Attempting to destroy it is comparable to attempting to destroy the concept of depth or width or time. But, Kratos prompted, because he had heard that particular tone before, in the voice of Hephaestus, when the smith god claimed a task was impossible while already planning how to achieve it. Kane's optical senses brightened. But, your blades killed a demon permanently. That suggests they do not simply harm warp entities, they unwrite them from existence. If we can understand that principle, replicate it, amplify it, we might create a resonance cascade, a weapon that does not attack the warp directly, but instead attacks the connection points, the places where it bleeds into our reality. Sever enough connections simultaneously, and theoretically, the immaterium would collapse inward, unable to sustain its presence in our dimension. Theoretically, Valdor repeated, his voice carrying a weight of skepticism. Science, Kane said, is the art of turning theory into fact through sufficient application of force. Kratos drew his blades. The blades of chaos, forged in the depths of Olympus by a god who had wanted to chain him forever to servitude, and the Leviathan axe, created by dwarven smiths who understood that ice was not just cold, but the absence of heat, the negation of energy itself. They had killed Ares, god of war. They had killed Zeus, king of gods. They had killed the concept of fate when he severed the threads the sisters wove. He offered them to Kane. Then let us begin. The Archmagos reached out with manipulator arms that trembled with something that might have been reverence, or might have been fear. As his instruments touched the blades, every sensor in the laboratory screamed warnings. The equipment registered energy signatures that corresponded to no known spectrum. The blades existed. They were matter. They were real. But they were also something else, something that human science had no words for because human science had never needed words for weapons that could kill the unkillable. By the Omnissiah, Kane whispered, and it might have been prayer or blasphemy. What are you? Kratos looked at the sphere of impossible metal, at the machinery humming in the darkness, at the custodians who had followed him into this corrupted place, because their Primarch had calculated that desperation plus impossibility sometimes equaled survival. I am what remains, he said, when gods demand too much and men refuse to die. Above them, Terra shook under renewed bombardment. The War Master's forces pressed closer. The clock ticked toward midnight, and in the depths of Forge Tertius Obscurus, wreathed in the light of technology that should not exist, the forging of deicide began. The forging took 36 hours. Kratos stood motionless through all of it, watching Kane's manipulator arms dance across the examination platform, watching servitors modified beyond recognition perform calculations in languages that predated human speech, watching his blades unmade and remade in ways that should have destroyed them, but somehow did not. He did not sleep. He had learned long ago that sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought memories, and memories brought the faces of everyone he had failed to save. But standing in the half-light of the corrupted laboratory, surrounded by machinery that whispered secrets in dead tongues, the memories came anyway. Her name had been Lysandra. His daughter's name had been Calliope. Simple names, common names, the kind worn by thousands of women and children across the Mediterranean world, ground down by the same poverty and petty cruelties that made empires function. He could still remember the weight of Calliope in his arms when she was newly born, the way she had gripped his finger with a strength that seemed impossible for something so small. He could still remember Lysandra's laugh, the real one she saved for moments when the world was not watching, when she could forget she had married a monster wearing a Spartan's face. He had killed them in the temple of Athena. Ares had clouded his mind with battle rage, had pointed him at shadows in the darkness and whispered that they were enemies. By the time the madness cleared, by the time he saw what his blades had done, it was already too late for prayer or mercy, or the comforting lie that gods were just. The integration is proving difficult, Khorne said, pulling Kratos from the memory. The Archmagos hovered near the examination platform, where the blades of chaos lay partially disassembled, their chains spread across the metal surface like neural pathways mapped for surgery. Your weapons contain properties that resist analysis. Every time I believe I understand their function, the data shifts. It is as though they remember being divine and resent being studied by mortals. They were made by a god, Kratos said. Hephaestus forged the chains. Ares bound them to my flesh so I could never be free of them, never lay down the violence he needed me to perform. They have drunk the blood of Titans and Olympians. They know what they are. Khorne's optical sensors focused on the patterns etched into the blade surfaces, equations written in a language that predated human mathematics. Pain is encoded in the metal itself, not metaphorically, literally. The atomic structure contains compressed information density that should collapse under its own coherence, yet remains stable. Suffering as a binding force, rage as structural integrity. The Archmagos paused, his vox unit producing a sound like grinding gears. Whoever made these understood that consciousness is not separate from matter, but encoded within it. That emotion can be made physical if you compress it enough, heat it enough, fold it into itself until it becomes harder than diamond and sharper than obsidian. He understood, Kratos said quietly, that the best chains are the ones you cannot see. A scream echoed through the facility, not from the corrupted machinery or the twisted servitors, but from something deeper, something that originated in the space between spaces where the warp pressed against reality's membrane. The custodians raised their guardian spears. Valdor activated his vox link to the surface. The response came through layers of static and interference that should not exist in hardline communication. Minor breach at sub-level 7, a tech priest's voice reported. Neverborn manifestation, estimated threat level moderate. Containment teams responding. Moderate, Valdor repeated flatly. In the weeks since the siege began, the custodians had recalibrated their threat assessments. Minor meant only a few dozen dead. Moderate meant casualties in the hundreds. Severe meant evacuate and call for Primarch intervention. They are testing, Kratos said. He approached the nearest wall where the corruption had spread deepest, where the metal surface rippled like water disturbed by something moving beneath. The warp feels what we are doing. It does not understand yet, but it feels the danger. Like an animal that smells fire before it sees flames. He pressed his palm flat against the wall. The metal was warm, fever-hot, pulsing with a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat. Through the physical contact, he could feel it. The vast weight of the immaterium pressing in from the other side, the endless screaming hunger of the Chaos Gods and their demonic children, the accumulated psychic trauma of a galaxy at war feeding back on itself in loops of perpetual suffering. And beneath that, deeper still, he felt something else, something old, something that had existed before the current gods, before the war in heaven, before the elder things shaped the webway from the bones of creation. A memory of what the warp had been before consciousness corrupted it, before thought itself had learned to scream. It was not always like this, Kratos said. Your warp. It was something else once, something clean. Khorne glided closer, his instruments extending to measure the wall's surface, to record Kratos' biometric data, to capture every word for later analysis. The Mechanicum archives contain fragments, data psalms passed down from the dark age of technology, before the age of strife, before human psychers became common. The legends speak of a time when the warp was merely the sea between stars. Turbulent, yes, dangerous certainly, but navigable, rational. The storms came later, when humanity's suffering reached critical mass and our emotions birthed the things that now feed upon us. Then it can be what it was before, Kratos said. He pulled his hand away from the wall. The metal surface where he had touched it was cold now, frost spreading across its surface in fractal patterns. Gods are made. That means they can be unmade. You starve them. You deny them worship. You kill everyone who believes in them until belief itself dies. We number in the quintillions, Valdor said carefully. Humanity spans 1,000,000 worlds. Even if we could kill the Chaos Gods, even if your weapon succeeds, the cost would be extinction. The warp sustains our Imperium. The Astronomicon guides our ships. Navigators see through its currents. Astropaths communicate across the void. Librarians channel its power in our defense. Destroy the warp, and you destroy the Imperium's ability to function. Yes, Kratos agreed. The single word fell into silence. Even Kane's constant binary cant stuttered to a halt. The custodians exchanged glances behind their helmets, silent communication passing between warriors who had trained together for lifetimes. You understand what you are proposing, Valdor said slowly. You understand that success means the death of everything the Emperor has built. No faster-than-light travel. No psychic communion. Every human world isolated, cut off, alone in the darkness of space. Xenos empires would devour us piecemeal. We would regress to scattered tribes orbiting dead stars, waiting for extinction. I have ended worlds before, Kratos said. He turned away from the wall, away from the pressing weight of the Immaterium's hunger, and met Valdor's gaze without flinching. I broke the gods of Olympus. I shattered the cycle of patricide that had ruled since the Titans. When I was done, Greece drowned. The sun went dark. The seas boiled and the earth cracked open, and everything my people had built burned to ashes. I did that. I own that. And I would do it again, because the alternative was to let the gods continue their games, continue their cruelties, continue demanding that mortals suffer for divine entertainment. He moved back to the examination platform, where his blades lay in pieces, where Kane's machinery probed their secrets with the desperate hunger of a species that had run out of miracles. Your Emperor fights on two fronts, above, against his traitor son, below, in your webway, against the tide of demons that pour through his broken dream. He is dying by degrees. Even if he wins, even if Horus falls, the warp will remain. The gods will remain, and they will feed on humanity's suffering until the stars burn out and the last human soul is consumed. The Emperor has a plan, Valdor said, but there was something in his voice, a hairline fracture in his absolute certainty, that suggested even the Captain General of the Legio Custodes had begun to doubt. I have known gods and their plans, Kratos said. Athena promised wisdom, Ares promised victory, Zeus promised justice. They all lied. Gods always lie because they exist forever and mortals exist only briefly, and it is easy to make promises to the dying. He picked up one of the chain links from his disassembled blades, turned it over in his scarred hands. Your Emperor may be different, but he is still a god, whatever name he wears. And gods require worship. Worship requires faith. Faith requires that mortals remain less than their masters, because the day humanity needs no gods is the day gods cease to matter. Another scream echoed through the facility, closer this time. The lights flickered. Somewhere in the depths below, something was trying very hard to reach them, to stop what they were building, to preserve the order of things where gods ruled and mortals suffered, and the cycle continued forever. Kane's instruments chimed completion. The Archmagos lifted the blades of chaos, now modified, now carrying within their metal structure fragments of the cold iron sphere, now resonating with frequencies that made reality itself uncomfortable. The integration is complete. Theoretical efficiency calculated at 91%. Practical testing impossible without exposing this facility to catastrophic warp incursion. He offered the blades to Kratos. You will have one attempt, one strike. Miss, and the backlash will annihilate everything within 100 miles. Succeed, and the consequences will reshape the galaxy. Choose carefully which future you prefer. Kratos took his weapons back. They felt heavier now, weighted with purpose beyond simple killing. He had carried them for so long that they had become extensions of himself, phantom limbs that remembered every life they had taken, every god they had broken. Now they carried something else. A promise, a threat, an ending written in metal and blood, and the crystallized pain of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I prefer," Kratos said, strapping the blades to his back where they belonged, "a future where gods learn to fear the mortals they claim to rule." Above them, Terra's death continued. Below them, the warp pressed closer, and in the space between, a weapon that should not exist waited to be tested against a target that should not die. The screaming in the depths grew louder. It was time to descend. The descent took 4 hours through corridors that twisted in ways that defied the structural blueprints Kane consulted. The Archmagos led them deeper into the Imperial Palace's subterranean levels, past Mechanicum workshops where tech priests had once labored in the Emperor's service, past armories that now stood empty, past barracks that would never again house the soldiers who had died defending them. The walls changed as they went down. Marble and adamantium gave way to older materials, pre-unification architecture, then stonework that predated the age of strife, then something else entirely. Surfaces that looked carved rather than built, that bore markings in languages even Kane's extensive archives could not translate. "We are approaching the Webway Junction," Kane said. His Vox unit carried interference now, static that came and went in rhythms almost like breathing. "The Emperor maintains the seal 200 meters ahead. Beyond that threshold, conventional physics becomes negotiable. Time dilates, space folds, matter remembers shapes it has never held. You will see things that cannot exist. You will hear voices you recognize. Ignore them. They are predators wearing familiar faces, testing which mask frightens you most." Kratos had heard similar warnings before, from priests who guarded the gates to Hades, from sibyls who spoke prophecies at Delphi's edge. He had ignored them then too. Fear was a tool. It worked best on those who still had something to lose. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that had no business existing beneath the palace. It stretched upward into darkness that swallowed the lumen light, a cathedral of shadow and negative space. At its center stood a gate, not the simple doorway the word suggested, but a wound in reality itself. A tear in the fabric of existence through which impossible colors bled and geometries that hurt to perceive writhed with malevolent purpose. The gate was held closed by what appeared to be pure golden light, a barrier that blazed so bright it left after images burned into the retinas of anyone foolish enough to look directly at it. Behind that light, Kratos could sense him. The Emperor of mankind, the being these people called Master of Humanity, sitting upon his golden throne and fighting a war across dimensions that would have shattered lesser minds in seconds. The psychic pressure radiating from that presence was immense, a weight that pressed down on reality itself, forcing the warp back through sheer will and power that dwarfed anything Kratos had encountered in this universe. Almost anything. Because through the cracks in the golden barrier, through the places where the Emperor's attention had to divide itself between too many fronts, other presences pushed. Vast things, hungry things, beings that existed on a scale that made the Olympian gods look like children playing at divinity. Khorne, whose rage could shatter planets. Nurgle, whose pestilence spread through space and time. Tzeentch, whose schemes rewrote causality. Slaanesh, whose hungers consumed civilizations. The four powers of chaos, bloated on 10,000 years of human suffering, pressing against the barrier like ocean depths pressing against a submarine's hull, waiting for the moment when the seal would crack and the flood would begin. "This is what you want to kill," Valdor said quietly. The Custodian stood at Kratos' shoulder, his guardian spear held ready but useless, because what use were physical weapons against concepts made manifest? This is the warp, the sea of souls, the immaterium, humanity's collective unconscious given form and hunger. Every thought, every emotion, every dream and nightmare of a billion souls reflected and amplified until it gained sentence. You cannot fight this. You cannot negotiate with it. You can only endure it or fall to it, or flee from it if you are fast enough and lucky enough and strong enough to escape. "I see gods," Kratos said. "Powerful ones, but still gods. Still things that want, that fear, that can be hurt." He moved closer to the barrier, feeling its heat on his ash-gray skin, feeling the golden light probe at his mind, looking for weakness, for corruption, for any sign that he carried the taint of chaos. It found nothing. Whatever scars Kratos bore, whatever darkness lived in his past, it was mortal darkness, human darkness, the kind earned through choice and consequence, not infection or possession. The Emperor's presence turned a fraction of its attention toward him. Kratos felt the weight of that regard, felt the master of mankind's consciousness brush against his own like a titan's hand, reaching down to examine an insect. There was curiosity there, calculation, and something else. Recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement that passed between beings who had both committed acts they could never fully justify, who had both sacrificed innocence on the altar of greater goods that remained forever debatable. Then the attention moved away, back to the war in the webway, and Kratos was simply a man standing before an impossible gate again. "The barrier cannot be lowered," Kane said. His instruments were going haywire, sensors overloading as they tried to process the quantum impossibilities manifesting around the gate. "If the Emperor's seal fails, demons will pour through in numbers beyond counting. The Imperial Palace will fall in minutes. Terra will drown in warp spawn within hours. The Sol system will become a realm of chaos before the day ends. Then we do not lower it," Kratos said. He drew the blades of chaos from his back. The modified weapons hummed with power now, resonating with the cold iron integrated into their structure, creating zones of null space that pushed back against the warp's presence. Where the blades moved, reality solidified. Demons pressing against the barrier from the other side recoiled, their essence burned by proximity to something that denied their existence. "We go around it." He drove both blades into the chamber floor. The cold iron's properties spread through the stone like frost racing across a window, creating a circle of stability in the madness. Within that circle, the laws of physics reasserted themselves with desperate intensity. Gravity normalized. Time flowed linearly. Matter remembered what it was supposed to be. "Kane," Kratos said, "you told me the warp bleeds into your reality at connection points. This gate is one. Where are the others?" The Archmagos consulted data streams flowing through his augmented consciousness, pulling information from archives scattered across Mars and Terra and 100 Forge worlds whose databases he could still access despite the War Master's blockade. 13 major warp rifts exist within the Sol system, 471 minor incursions across Terra itself, 8,916 documented sites where the barrier between materium and immaterium has worn thin enough to permit demon manifestation without active summoning rituals. Kane's optical sensors swept across Kratos. "You cannot reach them all. You are one being. Even with weapons that kill demons permanently, even with modified archaeotech that creates null zones, you cannot be in 8,000 places simultaneously." "No," Kratos agreed. But I do not need to be in 8,000 places. I need to be in one place, the place where all of them connect, the source. Valdor stepped forward. There is no single source. The warp is infinite. It touches our reality at infinite points. What you are describing is impossible. Everything is impossible, Kratos said, until you find the one weak point that makes it possible. He looked at the golden barrier, at the Emperor's light holding back the tide, at the cracks spreading through the seal, as the master of mankind's strength slowly, inevitably failed. Your Emperor fights on two fronts. Above, the Warmaster threatens. Below, the warp threatens. He cannot win both battles, but if one battle ended, if the warp could no longer touch your reality, he would be free to face Horus with his full strength. How? Cain demanded. Binary cant spilled from his Vox unit in cascades of increasingly desperate calculations. How do you sever the connection between dimensions? How do you cut reality itself? Kratos turned the blades of chaos in his hands, watching light play across their modified surfaces, watching the way the cold iron made reality ripple and fold around the weapons like cloth gathering around a needle's point. He had cut many things in his long existence. The thread of fate that the Sisters of Destiny wove, the chains of Atlas that held the world, the very concept of divine immortality when he drove his blade through Zeus's heart and watched the king of gods bleed out on Olympus's summit. Cutting a dimension would be harder, but the principle remained the same. Everything that existed had a structure. Structure had weak points. Weak points could be exploited by someone willing to look for them, to test them, to apply precisely calibrated force at precisely the right angle until the impossible became merely difficult and the difficult became achievable. You go inside, Kratos said simply. You find where it lives, where it thinks, where it dreams its dreams of eating your reality, and then you kill it from within, the way you kill any parasite. You cut out its heart. The warp has no heart, Valdor said. It has no center. It is chaos made manifest. It is the absence of order, of structure, of anything that could be targeted or destroyed. Everything has a heart, Kratos replied. Everything that wants, that hungers, that grows. It has something that sustains it. Find that, and you can kill anything. He sheathed the blades of chaos and faced the Custodians, the Archmagos, the golden barrier holding back infinity. I need a way in, not through your Emperor's gate. I need a path that takes me into the warp itself, into the realm where your Chaos Gods dwell, where I can find the connection between their dimension and yours, and sever it permanently. Cain's Vox unit emitted a sound like gears grinding themselves to fragments. What you describe is unprecedented, a living being entering the warp without Geller field protection, without psychic shielding, without any of the safeguards that keep human consciousness intact when exposed to the Immaterium's raw chaos. The result would be instant madness, possession, dissolution of self. You would cease to exist as a coherent entity within seconds. I have been to places like your warp, Kratos said quietly. I have walked through Hades where the dead scream eternally. I have climbed from the depths of Tartarus where the Titans were imprisoned. I have stood in the void between worlds where nothing exists except the absence of existence. I am still here, still myself, still sane enough to fight. He paused. Mostly. Valdor studied him for a long moment. The Captain General of the Legio Custodes, who had stood at the Emperor's side for 10,000 years, who had seen the birth of the Imperium and the fall of its brightest suns, who had defended Terra against Xenos horrors and traitor primarchs and demonic incursions beyond counting, a being who had been built by the master of mankind to be the ultimate guardian, the perfect warrior, the unbreakable shield. And in that moment, studying Kratos' scarred face and empty eyes, Valdor made a calculation that would echo through the centuries to come. "There is one way," he said slowly. "One path into the warp that does not require the Emperor's gate, but it is forbidden. Sealed by the master of mankind himself at the Unification's dawn, never to be reopened." He activated his Vox link. "This is Captain General Valdor. Authorization Ultima. I require immediate access to Vault Mortis beneath the Himalasian mountains. Priority cannot be overstated. Terra's survival depends on it." The response came through layers of security protocols and authorization codes that took 17 seconds to verify. When it finished, Kane's optical sensors brightened with something that might have been horror, or might have been awe. "Vault Mortis," the Archmagos whispered. "The Emperor's first mistake. The door he should never have opened." "What is it?" Kratos asked. Valdor's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried weight that pressed down like a physical force. "It is where the Emperor first learned that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. It is the place where he discovered the warp's existence, where he first made contact with the beings that would one day call themselves gods. It is humanity's original sin, encoded in stone and sealed with warnings in 1,000 languages." The Custodian's guardian spear glowed with barely contained power. "It is your way in. And if you succeed, if you truly kill the warp itself, then every death that follows, every human world that falls to isolation and Xenos predation, every child who starves when the supply lines collapse and the Imperium fragments, all of that blood will be on your hands alongside ours." "I have carried worse," Kratos said. And in the silence that followed, while Terra burned above and the Emperor fought his eternal war below, the decision was made. The path was chosen, and the weapon that should not exist moved toward the target that should not die, driven by a being who had already destroyed one pantheon and saw no reason why he could not destroy another. The screaming in the depths grew louder. It sounded almost like laughter. Vault Mortis sat beneath 3 miles of rock in the Himalasian range, accessible only through a single transit tunnel that had been sealed with mechanisms designed by the Emperor himself during the Unification Wars. The journey took 6 hours by subterranean rail, through passages carved when the planet was still called Earth, and humanity still dreamed of futures uncomplicated by gods and monsters. Kratos rode in silence, surrounded by custodians who watched him with the wary attention soldiers reserved for unexploded ordnance. Kane occupied himself with final calculations, running simulations that all ended the same way. Catastrophic failure, with a margin of error so small it might as well not exist. The vault's entrance was a door 40 feet high and 20 feet wide, carved from a single piece of obsidian that reflected no light. Inscriptions covered every inch of its surface in languages that predated Proto-Indo-European, warnings written by the Emperor when he still believed warnings could prevent catastrophe. Kratos read them without needing translation. He had seen similar warnings before, carved into the gates of Pandora's temple, etched into the walls of the Titan's prison. Humanity's fear of the unknown wore the same face in every universe. "The Emperor sealed this place in the 31st millennium," Valdor said, as his custodians worked the locking mechanisms, their combined strength barely sufficient to move the massive door. "Before the Great Crusade, before the Primarchs, when he was still learning what the warp truly was, what it could do to unprepared minds." The door ground open with a sound like continental plates shifting. Beyond it lay darkness, so complete it seemed actively hostile to the concept of illumination. 13 tech priests entered this vault to study what lay within. 12 died instantly. The 13th lived for 6 minutes, long enough to transmit his findings back to Mars before his mind collapsed and his body began rejecting the concept of having a body. "What did he find?" Kratos asked. "A door," Khorne said quietly. Not metaphorical, an actual physical door, carved from materials that should not exist, bearing inscriptions that predate humanity by millions of years. The Emperor theorized it was built by the Old Ones, the ancient race that shaped the galaxy before the war in heaven, before the Necrons, before the Eldar. A door between dimensions, a permanent connection to the warp, stable and controlled, that someone with sufficient knowledge could use to enter the Immaterium directly. They descended into the vault. The darkness retreated reluctantly before their lights, revealing a chamber that should not fit within the physical space they had entered. It was vast beyond measurement, its boundaries uncertain, its architecture suggesting perspectives that human eyes struggled to process. At the chamber's center stood the door Khorne had described. It was 12 feet tall, 8 feet wide, carved from stone that shifted colors as they watched. Black, then gray, then white, then something that was all three simultaneously and none of them at all. The inscriptions covering its surface were not warnings. They were instructions. Kratos approached the door while the custodians maintained a perimeter that felt more ceremonial than practical. This far beneath Terra, in this place where the Emperor had first touched the warp's edge, conventional military doctrine meant nothing. If something came through that door, if the Chaos Gods chose this moment to manifest their full attention, then all the guardian spears in the Imperium would be as useful as candles against a supernova. He studied the inscriptions, his mind parsing meanings that should have been incomprehensible, but somehow were not. The Old Ones had written in concepts rather than words, encoding information directly into the stone's quantum structure so that anyone sufficiently advanced could read it regardless of language. The message was simple, brutally so. "This door leads to the warp's foundation," Kratos said. "To the place where the Immaterium touches the Materium most directly, where the barrier between dimensions is thinnest, where reality itself is most vulnerable." He traced one of the inscriptions with a scarred finger. The Old Ones built it as an escape route. When their war with the Necrons turned against them, when their civilization began to collapse, they planned to flee into the warp, to hide in the spaces between thought and matter where physical weapons could not reach. "They never escaped," Khorne observed. "The Old Ones vanished from galactic history. No trace of their civilization remains except ruins and warnings." "Because they learned too late," Kratos said, "that you cannot hide from gods by entering their domain. The warp consumed them, drank them, ate everything they were until only echoes remained, absorbed into the chaos, screaming forever in the spaces between dimensions." He stepped back from the door. "This is my way in. But once I cross that threshold, I cannot come back. Not until the work is finished. Not until the warp is dead or I am." Valdor moved to stand beside him. The Captain General's expression remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested the weight of decisions made in the Emperor's name, of choices that would echo through millennia, whether they succeeded or failed. "The Emperor charged us with defending humanity," Valdor said quietly, "with preserving civilization, with protecting the Imperium he built across 30,000 years of blood and sacrifice. What you propose threatens all of that. Yet," he paused, and for the first time since Kratos had arrived on Terra, the Custodian's absolute certainty wavered. "Yet, the Imperium is already dying. We simply die slowly, degree by degree, while the Chaos Gods feed on our suffering and grow stronger with each passing year. Perhaps a quick death is more merciful than a slow one. Perhaps oblivion is preferable to eternal torment." "There is no mercy in what I do," Kratos said. "Only necessity. Only the knowledge that some chains must be broken no matter the cost, because the alternative is slavery without end." He drew the blades of chaos. The modified weapons hummed with barely contained power, their edges vibrating at frequencies that made reality uncomfortable. "When I enter the warp, When I begin cutting the connections between dimensions, the Chaos Gods will feel it immediately. They will turn their full attention toward me. Your Emperor will have a window. Minutes, perhaps. Maybe an hour if I fight well enough. In that time, he must move against Horus. He must end the War Master before the traitor forces realize their demonic support has vanished. 1 hour, Valdor repeated, to climb from the depths of the Imperial Palace, to reach the vengeful spirit in orbit, to confront Horus, defeat him, and return before the siege forces regroup. He calculated probabilities with the speed of a being purpose-built for tactical assessment. The Emperor could do it. If he were free to move, if the webway seal no longer required his attention, if the demons no longer threatened Terra's foundation. A pause. But transmission delay alone will cost us minutes. By the time we inform him of your success, by the time he acts on that information, your window may already be closing. Then do not wait for confirmation, Kratos said. The moment I cross that threshold, the moment that door opens, you tell him to move. You tell him that the warp is dying, and he has one chance to strike while his enemies are blind and confused and afraid. You tell him that a mortal man is doing what gods claimed was impossible, and he should do no less. Kane's Vox unit crackled with something that might have been objection or might have been prayer. The risk is immeasurable. If you fail, if the warp does not die, if the Chaos Gods simply destroy you and return their attention to Terra, then the Emperor will be exposed, vulnerable. The War Master will have the opening he needs to strike the killing blow, to end the Master of Mankind and claim Terra for the ruinous powers. Then I will not fail, Kratos said simply. He placed his hand against the door. The stone was warm, fever-hot, pulsing with a rhythm that suggested something alive on the other side. He could feel the warp's presence now, feel the immaterium pressing against the barrier like ocean depths pressing against a submarine's hull, feel the accumulated weight of a billion souls suffering compressed into a dimension that had no space for compassion or mercy or any emotion except the ones that fed the four powers, their endless feast. Khorne's rage, an ocean of blood. Nurgle's despair, a garden of rot. Tzeentch's ambition, a labyrinth of lies. Slaanesh's hunger, a symphony of excess. And beneath them all, older and darker, the thing the warp had been before consciousness corrupted it. The raw psychic substrate of reality, the medium through which thoughts traveled and emotions rippled, now so thoroughly polluted by 10,000 years of war and suffering that it had become toxic to the very life it once sustained. I have a question, Valdor said suddenly. Before you go, before you do this thing that cannot be undone. The custodian's voice carried no judgment, only curiosity tinged with something that might have been respect. Why? You are not of this universe. These are not your gods. This is not your war. You could simply leave, find another door, another path, another world where gods have not yet learned to feed on mortal suffering. Why choose this? Why risk everything for a species you have no obligation to save? Kratos was silent for a long moment. Behind him, Terra continued its slow death. Above him, the War Master's forces pressed closer to the Imperial Palace. Across the galaxy, 1,000,000 worlds burned while their populations prayed to gods who answered only with demands for more suffering, more faith, more blood spilled in their names. He thought of Lysandra, of Calliope, of the Spartan soldiers who had followed him into battles they could not win because their gods demanded it, of the slaves who had died building temples to divine vanity, of the children sacrificed on altars to ensure good harvests, of all the small, quiet cruelties that gods inflicted on mortals because they could, because it amused them, because immortality bred boredom and boredom bred casual monstrosity. Because, Kratos said finally, I have seen what happens when gods rule unopposed. I have seen civilizations ground to dust beneath divine whim. I have seen good men corrupted, innocent women destroyed, children murdered, all in service to beings who view mortal life as entertainment or fuel or disposable resources. He turned to face Valdor, and in his eyes burned something that had survived the death of Olympus, the drowning of Greece, the collapse of everything he had ever known. Your Chaos Gods are no different. They are parasites wearing crowns, feeding on suffering they themselves create, demanding worship from those they torment. And I have spent lifetimes learning one truth that gods fear above all others. What truth? Valdor asked. That they can die, Kratos said. That their immortality is a lie. That sufficient rage, sufficient determination, sufficient refusal to kneel can break even the most powerful tyrant if you are willing to pay the price. He placed both hands against the door. I have already paid. Everything I loved, everything I was. I have nothing left to lose except the knowledge that when I die, truly die, I will do so knowing I tried to break every chain I ever found, including the ones that bind your species to gods who do not deserve devotion. The door began to open, not pushed from the outside but drawn open from within, as though the warp itself recognized Kratos for what he was and welcomed the chance to test itself against something new, something that had killed gods before, something that did not understand why the impossible should remain impossible simply because no one had tried hard enough to make it possible. Light spilled through the widening crack. Not light as physics understood it, but warp light, psychic radiation compressed into visual spectrum, colored in shades that human eyes were not designed to process. With it came sound. The screaming Kratos had followed from his universe to this one, amplified 1,000-fold, the accumulated agony of every soul the warp had ever touched, howling its existence into the material realm. Kane's instruments exploded, Valdor's custodians staggered, their conditioning barely sufficient to keep them conscious. Only Kratos remained standing, remained focused, remained sane as the warp's full attention turned toward him and found him wanting to devour, wanting to break, wanting to claim as another trophy in the endless collection of mortal failures. The Chaos Gods spoke as one, their voices layered harmonics of madness. We know you, God-killer. We have tasted your universe's death. We have drunk the dreams of your Olympians as they dissolved into nothing. Did you think you could hide from us? Did you think your crimes would go unpunished? Come, then. Enter our realm. Learn what happens when mortal pride challenges eternal power. Kratos stepped through the door, and reality screamed. The warp was nothing like Kratos expected, and exactly like every nightmare he had ever suppressed. There was no ground, no sky, no up or down or linear progression of space that made sense to a mind built for 3 dimensions. He existed in all places simultaneously while occupying none of them. His consciousness stretched across geometries that folded back on themselves in loops of recursive madness. Colors that had no names burned against his retinas. Sounds that predated language scraped against his eardrums. Smells that corresponded to no chemical compound known to material science filled his nostrils with the scent of burning time and rotting futures. But beneath the chaos, beneath the sensory assault designed to shatter mortal consciousness into digestible fragments, Kratos found structure. Everything had structure. Even madness followed rules if you looked hard enough, if you refused to let the surface horror distract from the underlying mechanics. The warp was not infinite. It was vast, yes, but vastness was not infinity. It had boundaries, edges where the immaterium pressed against the materium like a bubble pressed against a wall. It had currents, flows of psychic energy that moved in patterns shaped by the emotions feeding them. It had architecture, not physical architecture, but conceptual architecture. Ideas made manifest and given weight, by the collective unconsciousness of every sentient being who had ever felt fear or rage or despair or hunger. And at that architecture's heart, where all the currents converged, where all the patterns originated, sat 4 thrones. Kratos moved toward them, not walked. Movement in the warp had no relationship to physical locomotion. He simply decided to be closer to the thrones, and reality bent to accommodate his will because he refused to accept any other outcome. Distance became negotiable, time folded, space contracted, and with each iteration of movement that should not work but did, he felt the attention of the Chaos Gods focus more precisely on his presence. Khorne's realm materialized around him first. Mountains of skulls stretched to horizons that curved wrong, bone cairns built from every warrior who had ever died in service to the blood god's eternal war. Rivers of blood flowed upward, defying gravity because gravity was a material realm concern, and the warp recognized no laws except appetite. Demons manifested in his path, bloodletters with brass blades and burning eyes, bloodthirsters with wings of tattered flesh and rage made physical. They charged with the inevitability of avalanches. Kratos met them with the blades of chaos. The modified weapons sang through demon flesh like prayers through silence. Where they cut, the cold iron's null properties spread, creating zones of stability that forced the warp to remember what physics looked like. Demons died, not dispersed, not banished, died, their essence unraveling as the fundamental connection between their consciousness and the warp's substrate was severed at the quantum level. They had time to scream, to understand what was happening, to realize that the death they dealt to mortals had finally come for them. "You dare!" Khorne's voice shook the skull mountains, caused the blood rivers to boil. "You dare bring such weapons into my domain. You dare kill my children permanently. You who are nothing but rage-wearing mortal flesh. You who could be my greatest champion if you only accepted your nature." Kratos did not answer. He had learned long ago that gods only spoke when they wanted something. And anything they wanted was something he should deny them. He pushed deeper into the blood god's realm, cutting through demon hordes that manifested faster than he could kill them, fighting his way toward the throne that sat at the center of the Skull Mountains. But the deeper he went, the more he began to understand the problem. Khorne was not a being, not really. The blood god had no body, no single point of existence that could be targeted. Khorne was an idea, rage and bloodlust compressed into anthropomorphic form by human perception. The throne was symbolic, the realm was metaphorical. The demons were extensions of a consciousness so vast it defied traditional concepts of selfhood. Killing Khorne would require killing the idea of rage itself, would require reaching into every mind across the galaxy that had ever felt anger and removing that capacity like a surgeon excising cancer. Impossible, even with weapons that killed gods, even with the Old One's door and the cold iron's null properties, even with everything Kratos had learned from destroying Olympus, it was impossible. But destroying the connection between Khorne and the material realm, that was merely improbable. Kratos changed direction. Instead of moving toward the throne, he moved downward, sinking through layers of the warp's architecture like a man diving through ocean strata. The Skull Mountains fell away. The blood rivers evaporated. Khorne's roar of fury faded to distant thunder as Kratos descended past the Chaos Gods' domains, past the surface manifestations that mortal minds could comprehend, down to the foundation where the warp structure connected to material reality. And there he found it, a web, a network, trillions upon trillions of threads extending from the warp into the materium, each one corresponding to a sentient mind, each one feeding psychic energy back into the immaterium, like nerve endings feeding sensation to a brain. The threads pulsed with color and emotion, red for rage, green for despair, blue for ambition, purple for excess. They wove together into larger structures, into patterns that shaped the Chaos Gods' power, that sustained their existence, that gave them the energy to manifest in the material realm. This was what he needed to cut. Clever! Tzeentch's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere, layered with harmonics that suggested the Changer of Ways was speaking from multiple timelines simultaneously. You see the threads. You understand the connection. But do you understand the cost? Each thread represents a mind. Sever them, and those minds die. Every psyker, every navigator, every astropath, every human who has ever touched the warp's power. Billions of souls snuffed out in an instant. Is that not genocide? Is that not the very monstrosity you claim to oppose? Kratos reached out with one blade, touched a single thread. It vibrated at his touch, and through it he could feel the mind on the other end, a navigator on some distant ship, guiding her vessel through the warp's currents, unaware that her consciousness was being fed upon by entities that viewed her as nothing more than convenient fuel. He could feel her exhaustion, her fear, her desperate hope that her service to the Imperium meant something, that her sacrifice had purpose. If he cut the thread, she would die. Her ship would be lost in the warp, its Geller fields failing, its crew consumed by demons or driven mad by unfiltered exposure to the immaterium. He raised the blade. "Wait!" And this voice was new, familiar in ways that made his scarred hands tremble. It was Lysandra's voice, his dead wife speaking from the grave or from false memory, he could not tell which. "Wait, my love. Think, you have killed so many already. How many more must die before your rage is satisfied? How many innocents must burn on the altar of your vengeance against the gods?" He turned. She stood behind him, or the thing wearing her face stood behind him. Lysandra, as he remembered her, beautiful and sad and disappointed in the monster her husband had become. Beside her stood Calliope, his daughter, small and trusting and holding a doll she had loved before Ares made him kill her. "We forgave you," Lysandra said, and her voice was exactly right, exactly how he remembered it in the rare moments when sleep came and dreams were merciful. "We forgave you for what you did. We understood it was the gods' fault, not yours. But this..." She gestured at the threads, at the billions of minds hanging in the balance. "This is your choice. No god forces your hand. No divine madness clouds your judgment. If you do this, if you kill all these people, their blood will be yours alone to carry." Kratos looked at his daughter. Calliope smiled at him the way she had smiled on the last morning of her life, before the temple, before the darkness, before everything ended. "Come home, father," she said. "You have fought enough. You have killed enough. Come home to us. Let the galaxy burn if it must. You have already saved one world from the gods. You do not need to save them all." For a long moment, Kratos stood motionless. The threads pulsed around him. The warp pressed close. Somewhere far above, in the realms of the Chaos Gods, vast intelligences watched and waited to see if their gambit would succeed, if appealing to his guilt would stay his hand where threats could not. Then Kratos spoke, and his voice was empty of everything except tired certainty. "You are not her. You are not my daughter. You are lies wearing their faces, trying to find which memory cuts deepest." He raised the blades of chaos. "I have carried my family's deaths for lifetimes. I have worn their absence like a second skin. And I learned something in all those years of grief and guilt and rage that you cannot understand because you are gods, and gods do not understand mortals except as fuel." "What did you learn?" the thing wearing Lysandra's face asked. "That the dead do not want vengeance," Kratos said. "They do not want their deaths to justify more deaths. They want to be remembered. They want their lives to have meant something. And the only way I can honor them, The only way I can make their deaths mean anything is to ensure that no one else suffers what they suffered, that no more families are destroyed because gods view mortal life as entertainment. He brought the blades down in a double arc that split the false visions of his wife and daughter into fragments of dispersing warp energy. They screamed as they died, and the screams had nothing to do with Lysandra or Calliope, because those voices had never truly been theirs. "I do not ask forgiveness," Kratos said to the empty space where the illusions had stood. "I do not seek redemption. I simply refuse to let the pattern continue. I refuse to let gods feed on suffering unchallenged. And if that makes me a monster worse than the ones I fight, then so be it. I have been called worse by better." He turned back to the threads, to the billions of connections between the warp and material reality, to the infrastructure that sustained the Chaos Gods' power and gave them dominion over humanity's fate. And he began to cut. The blades of chaos moved in patterns that had no relationship to combat forms developed by mortal minds. Each stroke severed thousands of threads simultaneously, the cold iron's null properties spreading through the warp's substrate like fire through dry grass. Psychers across the galaxy began to die, their minds disconnected from the immaterium, their consciousness cut loose from the dimension that gave them power. Navigators screamed as their warp sight went dark. Astropaths clutched their heads as the voices they had always heard fell silent. Librarians of the Legiones Astartes felt their connection to the warp sever like limbs being amputated without anesthesia. And in the material realm, on Terra, in the depths of the Imperial Palace where he sat upon the golden throne fighting his eternal war, the Emperor of mankind felt the warp begin to die and understood in an instant what was happening. Valdor's Vox message reached him 3 seconds later. "Master, the weapon has been deployed. The mortal kills the warp. You must move against Horus now. You must end him while the Chaos Gods are blind." The Emperor rose from his throne for the first time in decades. The webway seal he had maintained through sheer psychic will collapsed the moment his attention shifted, but it no longer mattered. The demons that had pressed against the barrier for so long suddenly found themselves cut off from their source of power, their connection to the warp severing as Kratos's blades carved through the threads that sustained them. They dissolved without ceremony, without even having time to understand what was ending them. Terra's sky split open with golden light as the master of mankind ascended toward the vengeful spirit in orbit. And in the warp, surrounded by chaos gods who had finally begun to understand fear, Kratos cut deeper. The chaos gods attacked as one, not with demons or temptations or illusions, but with their full divine might, unfiltered. The concentrated malevolence of entities that had existed since consciousness first learned to hate itself. The warp convulsed around Kratos like a living thing in its death throes, reality itself weaponized against him. Khorne manifested as an ocean of blood that rose from below and crashed down with the weight of every act of violence ever committed. Nurgle's garden bloomed in impossible directions. Diseases that killed concepts rather than flesh, spreading through the spaces between thoughts. Tzeentch wove paradoxes into Kratos's perception, creating loops where cause preceded effect, and time ate itself in recursive spirals. Slaanesh sang a note so pure it promised to fulfill every desire Kratos had ever suppressed, to give him back everything he had lost if he would only stop, only rest. Only accept that some enemies were too vast to fight. Kratos endured. He had endured the box of Pandora, which contained every evil ever imagined. He had endured the flames of Olympus, which burned away lies and left only truth, no matter how terrible. He had endured the blade of Olympus driven through his own chest, his god power bleeding out while he clung to mortal determination as his only anchor to existence. This was worse. This was 4 gods simultaneously trying to tear his mind apart, to rewrite his consciousness into something that would serve them, to break the one mortal who had ever threatened their dominion over the material realm. The pain was exquisite. The pressure was immeasurable. His thoughts fragmented under the assault, memories scattering like leaves in a hurricane. But his hands never stopped moving. The blades of chaos continued their work, severing threads by the millions, cutting connections faster than the chaos gods could reinforce them. Each severed thread weakened the gods' grip on reality. Each disconnected mind reduced their power by one infinitesimal fraction. It was death by 10,000 cuts, applied to beings who had never imagined they could bleed. "You cannot win," Khorne roared, and for the first time in the blood god's eternal existence, his voice carried something other than rage. It carried fear. "Even if you sever every thread, even if you cut us off from the material realm, we will endure. We are the warp itself. We are emotion made manifest. So long as sentient beings feel rage, despair, ambition, hunger, we exist. We cannot die." "No," Kratos agreed, his voice hoarse from screaming, though he could not remember when he had started screaming. "You cannot die. But you can starve. You can diminish. You can fade to whispers and shadows, stripped of power, reduced to the nothing you were before mortals made the mistake of giving you form." He severed another million threads. Another million minds went dark across the galaxy. And maybe, in 10,000 years or 10 million, you will claw your way back. Maybe consciousness will recreate you from its own darkness. But this generation will be free. These people will live and die without gods feeding on their suffering. And that is enough. The warp shuddered. Not metaphorically. The dimension itself convulsed as the Chaos Gods' power base eroded beneath them. Khorne's throne cracked. Nurgle's garden withered. Tzeentch's impossible geometries collapsed into mundane angles. Slaanesh's symphony hit a discordant note and shattered into silence. And then, in desperation, they showed him the cost. The visions came faster than thought. Across the galaxy, navigator houses collapsed as their mutant scions died in waves, their third eyes going dark as the connection to the warp severed. Ships lost in the Immaterium's currents crashed into real space at random coordinates, crew dead, cargo lost, entire expeditions vanishing as though they had never existed. Astropathic choirs went silent mid-transmission, leaving worlds isolated, cut off from the Imperium's communication network. Forge worlds lost contact with Mars. Hive worlds stopped receiving food shipments. Frontier colonies found themselves alone in the darkness with no way to call for help. On Terra, in the Imperial Palace, librarians of the Legends Astartes collapsed. Their enhanced physiology kept them alive longer than baseline psychers, but the agony was proportional. They felt their gift ripped away, felt the door to the warp slam shut in their minds, felt themselves become merely mortal for the first time since the Emperor had recruited them. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand, felt his ancient body begin to fail as the psychic energy that had sustained him past any reasonable lifespan evaporated. He managed to send one final message to Rogal Dorn before his heart stopped. "Worth it. Tell him it was worth it." The Astronomicon flickered. The great psychic lighthouse that had guided humanity through the warp for 10,000 years dimmed as its chorus of psychers died at their posts. For a moment, just a moment, every ship in transit through the Immaterium lost its guiding light. Some navigators managed to drop back to real space in time. Most did not. The death toll climbed into the billions. Then, the trillions. "Look," Tzeentch hissed, weaving the visions tighter, forcing Kratos to see every death in crystalline detail. "Look at what your righteousness costs. Look at the children dying on worlds that will never receive another supply ship. Look at the soldiers abandoned on battlefields far from home. Look at the scholars and artists and dreamers whose minds burn out because you decided they were acceptable losses in your war against divinity. Kratos looked. He forced himself to see every face, every death, every consequence of the choice he had made. He watched an old woman on a frontier world realize that no help was coming, that her grandchildren would starve because the supply ships could no longer navigate. He watched a young boy on a forge world die clutching a crude toy, killed by industrial accident because the tech priest's calculations had relied on astropathic coordination that no longer existed. He watched a soldier on some nameless battlefield call for his mother as Xenos predators tore him apart, his regiment cut off and forgotten because the Imperium's communication network had collapsed. He watched. He remembered. He added their faces to the collection of ghosts he already carried, and his hands never stopped moving. "I know what I am doing," Kratos said, and his voice was empty of everything except tired honesty. "I know the price. I have always known the price. Every time I have fought gods, every time I have broken chains, the cost has been measured in innocent blood. When I killed Ares, Greece bled. When I destroyed Zeus, the world drowned. I do not do this because I believe I can save everyone. I do this because the alternative, letting gods rule unchallenged, is worse." "Worse!" Nurgle's voice bubbled up from depths of decay, carrying genuine confusion. "Worse than genocide? Worse than condemning billions to slow deaths? What madness drives you to believe that our dominion is worse than the isolation and suffering your actions guarantee?" "Because your suffering is eternal," Kratos said. He severed another billion threads. The warp buckled. The Chaos Gods' forms began to flicker, their manifestations losing coherence as the power sustaining them drained away. "The deaths I cause will end. Those who survive will rebuild. Maybe they will find new ways to travel between stars. Maybe they will learn to live on single worlds, accepting isolation as the price of freedom from gods. Maybe they will all die, and humanity will fade to extinction, and the galaxy will belong to Xenos who never made the mistake of creating gods from their own darkness." He met their gaze, all four of them simultaneously, impossible but true. "But whatever happens, it will be their choice, their future, not yours, not shaped by entities who view mortal suffering as a renewable resource to be harvested forever." The blades of chaos moved faster now, driven by desperation and determination in equal measure. Kratos' mortal body was failing. The warp's pressure was crushing his consciousness, like depth charges crushing a submarine. Blood ran from his eyes, his ears, his nose. His muscles tore under the strain of moving through a dimension where physical laws were suggestions. His mind fragmented further, memories mixing with hallucinations, past bleeding into present. He saw Sparta burning. He saw Olympus falling. He saw worlds he had never visited dying because of choices he was making now. He saw futures where humanity thrived without gods. He saw futures where humanity died in the darkness between stars. He saw paradoxes and possibilities and the infinite branching paths of causality spreading outward from this single moment. And still, he cut. The threads were fewer now. Millions became thousands. Thousands became hundreds. The Chaos Gods screaming had progressed from rage to genuine agony. They were not dying, could not die as Khorne had said, but they were diminishing, their power base crumbling, their connection to the material realm severing strand by strand. In the material realm, on the vengeful spirit, the Emperor of mankind stood before his fallen son. Horus the War Master, Horus the Betrayer, Horus, who had been the brightest and best of all the Primarchs before chaos, whispered promises in his ear. The traitor Primarch was weaker than he should have been. The gods who had empowered him were distracted, their attention pulled toward the impossible threat cutting away their foundations. For the first time since the heresy began, Horus was merely a Primarch facing his father, not a god-touched abomination wielding infinite power. "Father," Horus said, and his voice carried confusion, pain, the first stirrings of clarity as Chaos's grip weakened. What have I done?" The Emperor's response was not recorded. Some said he wept, some said he raged, some said he simply struck, the blade of judgment falling without hesitation or mercy. Whatever the truth, when the Emperor's power manifested fully, unbound by the need to maintain the webway seal, focused entirely on the son who had betrayed him, the outcome was never in doubt. Horus died, not dispersed, not banished, died, his soul obliterated so thoroughly that even the gods could not reclaim it for resurrection. The heresy's spine broke in that instant, and in the warp, Kratos severed the final thread. Silence fell. True silence. For the first time since consciousness began, the warp was empty of mortal presence. No minds fed it power, no emotions sustained it. The Chaos Gods remained, but they were shadows now, echoes of what they had been, stripped of the connection to material reality that had allowed them to manifest their will across the galaxy. Tzeentch laughed, a sound like glass bells shattering. "Clever, God-killer, so very clever. But you have forgotten one detail, one small, insignificant detail." Kratos turned toward the Changer of Ways, exhausted beyond measurement, his body held together by determination alone. "What detail?" "You," Tzeentch said. "You still carry a connection to the warp. Your consciousness exists here, in our realm, sustained by a thread that links you to the door you entered through. And so long as that thread remains, so long as one single connection persists between our dimension and yours." The god's form solidified, drawing power from Kratos' presence, rebuilding itself around the one remaining anchor to material reality. "We can rebuild, we can spread, we can use your mind as the seed from which our garden grows anew." Understanding crashed over Kratos like cold water. The final thread, his own connection to material reality, maintained through the Old One's door, allowing his consciousness to navigate the warp without dissolving. It was the crack in the dam, the flaw in the plan, the one remaining pathway through which the Chaos Gods could eventually claw their way back to dominion. There was only one solution. "No," Valdor's voice came through, somehow, impossibly, the Captain General's mind touching his, across dimensions through sheer force of will. "Do not do this. We can find another way. We can seal the door from our side, trap you there, but keep the connection severed. You can survive. You can—" Kratos reached back along his own thread, back toward the Old One's door, back toward material reality and everything it represented. He wrapped the blades of chaos around the connection that sustained his existence. "I have survived enough," he said, and he cut. Pain. Not the pain of physical injury or even psychic assault, but something deeper, the pain of existence itself, unraveling. Kratos felt his consciousness fragment as the thread connecting him to material reality severed. Without that anchor, without that pathway back to the dimension where matter and energy followed comprehensible rules, his mind began to dissolve into the warp's chaos like salt dissolving in water. He should have died instantly. Any mortal would have. Any being whose sense of self depended on the structures provided by material existence would have simply ceased to be, their consciousness absorbed into the immaterium's infinite psychic soup. But Kratos was not any mortal. He had died before. Multiple times. He had died and clawed his way back from Hades through sheer refusal to accept oblivion. He had died and been resurrected by gods who needed his rage. He had died and returned because death was simply another obstacle, another wall to break through, another absolute that could be made negotiable through sufficient application of will. Death, he had learned, was only permanent if you let it be. His consciousness compressed. Instead of allowing himself to scatter across the warp's infinite expanse, He pulled inward, contracting his sense of self into a singularity of determination so dense that the immaterium could not penetrate it. He became a point of absolute stillness in a dimension of perpetual chaos, a void of mortal will in an ocean of divine hunger. The Chaos Gods pressed close, trying to crack him open, trying to force their way into the space where his mind had retreated. But Kratos had spent lifetimes building walls against divine influence. Ares had tried to control him through rage. Athena had tried to manipulate him through wisdom. Zeus had tried to command him through authority. He had learned to recognize the touch of godhood on his thoughts, learned to seal himself against it, learned to create a fortress of self that no external force could breach without invitation. "Impressive," Khorne acknowledged, his voice diminished but not destroyed. "You persist even without form, even without connection to your original reality. But persistence is not victory. You have severed our link to the material realm, yes. You have diminished us, trapped us here in our own dimension, but you are trapped as well, and we have eternity to wait for your will to crack." Kratos did not respond. Response required energy, and energy was finite in ways that had not mattered when he still had a body. Instead, he observed, the warp without mortal minds feeding it was different, cleaner somehow, though still fundamentally chaotic. Without the constant input of human emotion, without the endless stream of suffering and hope and rage and despair that had sustained the Chaos Gods for millennia, the immaterium began to revert to something closer to its original state. It was still dangerous, still unstable, still a dimension where thought and matter intermingled in ways that violated material physics. But the malevolence was fading. The purposeful cruelty that the Chaos Gods had cultivated was diminishing as their power base eroded. Given enough time, centuries, perhaps millennia, the warp might become what it had been before consciousness corrupted it, simply a medium, a substrate, dangerous but not actively malicious. But that assumed Kratos could maintain his isolation. That assumed his will would not eventually crack under the pressure of eternity spent as a disembodied consciousness, surrounded by gods who wanted him broken. Time passed, or did not pass. In the warp, causality was negotiable, sequence was optional. Kratos might have been isolated for seconds or centuries. There was no way to measure, no external reference point to anchor perception. He simply existed, a point of stubborn mortality refusing to dissolve, while the Chaos Gods circled like sharks waiting for blood in the water. Then, impossibly, he felt something, a touch on his consciousness, not the hostile probing of the Chaos Gods, but something gentler, something familiar in ways that made no sense, because everything familiar existed in a dimension he could no longer reach. Kratos. The Emperor's voice somehow transmitted across the barrier between dimensions, impossibly clear despite the fact that no psychic connection should exist now that all threads had been severed. "I know you persist. I can feel the void you create in the warp's pattern, a space where chaos cannot penetrate. Impressive, but unsustainable." Kratos did not respond. Could not respond without revealing his position more clearly to the Chaos Gods. But he listened. "You severed my connection to the warp alongside everyone else's," the Emperor continued. "The Astronomicon is dark. My psychic gifts are gone. I am reduced to merely the most powerful baseline human, stripped of the divine might I cultivated across 40,000 years." A pause. It is liberating to be free of the warp's touch, to no longer hear the screaming of a billion souls, to know that when I die, truly die as I inevitably will, I will simply end rather than risk the warp's consumption. The voice shifted, became more formal, more purposeful. The heresy is over. Horus fell. The traitor legions broke when their demonic support vanished. They flee now, scattered and confused, diminished by the same severance that weakened me. Terra survives, the Imperium survives, but we are crippled, isolated. Every world cut off from every other world. FTL travel impossible without navigators to see through the warp. Communication impossible without astropaths to carry messages. We regress to scattered kingdoms orbiting dead stars, exactly as you warned. Another pause. Longer this time. When the Emperor spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been respect or might have been resignation. Malcador is dead. Millions of Psykers died when you severed the threads. Billions more will die in the chaos that follows. But they die free. They die knowing that their suffering no longer feeds gods, that their emotions no longer sustain parasites who view mortal life as renewable fuel. You gave humanity something I could not, an ending that is not eternal torment, a death that means something because it is final rather than prelude to demonic consumption. The voice began to fade, the impossible connection weakening. I do not know if you can hear this. I do not know if you persist as consciousness or if I speak to an echo. But if you endure, if some fragment of your will remains in the warp, know this. Your sacrifice is remembered. Your choice is honored. And when the last human dies on the last world under the light of the last star, we will die grateful that we had centuries free from gods rather than millennia in chains. Silence returned. The Emperor's presence withdrew, pulled back to the material realm where his diminished but still formidable power was needed to hold the Imperium together through the crisis Kratos' actions had precipitated. And in that silence, Kratos understood what he had to do, what he had always been going to do, from the moment he cut his own thread and trapped himself here. The Chaos Gods still existed, diminished, isolated, cut off from their power source, but existing. And existence meant potential. Given enough time, given enough opportunity, they might find another way to reach the material realm. Another species might evolve psychic potential. Another dimension might tear. The door Kratos had closed might eventually be reopened by those who forgot why it had been sealed, unless someone remained to guard it, to maintain the severance, to ensure that the barrier between dimensions stayed closed, not through mechanism or technology, but through constant, active will. Kratos compressed his consciousness tighter, smaller, harder. He became a seal rather than a prisoner, a lock rather than a captive. He positioned himself in the conceptual space between the warp and material reality, in the place where his severed thread had once connected, and he simply refused to allow reconnection, refused to permit the Chaos Gods' passage, refused to let the cycle begin again. No, Khorne roared, understanding finally dawning. You cannot endure forever. You are mortal. Your will is finite. Eventually, you must break. Eventually, Kratos agreed, his voice barely a whisper in the void. But not today, not this century, not while any part of me remembers why I started this. Nurgle's laugh bubbled up from depths of decay. Such determination, such beautiful, futile determination. But determination is simply another form of hope, and hope is my domain. Eventually you will despair. Eventually you will accept that your suffering is eternal, that your isolation has no end, that no one will remember your sacrifice because all who knew you are dust. I have always known that no one would remember, Kratos said. The gods I killed in my universe were forgotten within generations. The destruction I caused was blamed on natural disaster or divine wrath, never on a mortal who refused to kneel. History forgets uncomfortable truths. It prefers myths where gods are benevolent and mortals are grateful. I have never fought for memory. only for the knowledge that I tried. Tzeentch wove patterns around him, showing futures where his will broke, where he failed, where the Chaos Gods eventually clawed through his determination and reconnected to the material realm. See the futility, see the inevitable outcome. All possible timelines converge on your failure. Probability itself condemns you. Probability, Kratos said, is just another god that pretends its rules are absolute. I have broken probability before. Slaanesh sang a note that promised rest, promised peace, promised an end to the exhaustion that already wore at him, despite the timeless nature of his vigil. You suffer needlessly. Accept our offer. Become our champion. We will give you form again, purpose again, meaning beyond this pointless martyrdom. We will make you greater than you ever were. I have been God's champion before, Kratos said. I know what it costs. I know what it makes you become. I choose this instead. And so, the vigil began. Kratos, God-killer, reduced to a point of consciousness in the void between dimensions, holding closed a door that wanted to open, maintaining a severance that the Chaos Gods constantly tested for weakness. He had no body, no sense of time passing, no external stimulation, except the eternal pressure of divine will trying to crack his determination. He had his memories, Lysandra's laugh, Calliope's smile, the weight of his blades in hands he no longer possessed. The knowledge that somewhere in the material realm, humanity struggled forward into an uncertain future, but struggled free of gods, free of the chaos that had nearly consumed them, free to fail or flourish according to their own choices rather than divine whim. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because there was nothing else, and Kratos had spent too many lifetimes fighting to simply surrender now because the fight had become uncomfortable. The Chaos Gods pressed closer, patient, eternal, certain that eventually, inevitably, he would break. Kratos pressed back, stubborn, mortal, certain of nothing except that he had cut his last chain and would not allow it to be rebuilt. In the material realm, Terra began the long process of reconstruction. The Imperium fragmented but did not fall. Humanity adapted, finding new ways to survive without the warp, building slower ships that could not break light speed but could still reach nearby stars over generations. The galaxy became darker, lonelier, but the darkness was clean, the loneliness was free. And in the void between dimensions, a ghost that had once been a god-killer stood eternal watch, refusing to rest, refusing to break, refusing to let the pattern continue. Some burdens, he had learned, could not be laid down. Some prices could not be refused. Some wars could only be won by those willing to become the final casualty. He had destroyed gods before by killing them. Now he destroyed them by denying them, by becoming the eternal no that stood between their hunger and the prey they had claimed as theirs by right. It was not victory, but it was enough. And in the timeless void where he maintained his vigil, surrounded by gods who would never forgive him, Kratos found something approaching peace. Centuries passed in the material realm, or perhaps only decades. Time in the warp had no correlation to time outside it, and Kratos no longer had access to external reference points that might anchor his perception. He existed in an eternal now, a continuous present, where the only meaningful division was between the moment when his will held firm and the moment when it might crack. The Chaos Gods adapted their strategies. When direct assault failed, they tried subtlety. When threats proved useless, they offered bargains. When bargains were rejected, they simply waited in silence so profound it became its own form of torture, allowing Kratos to wonder if he still existed or if he had dissolved into the void centuries ago and simply had not noticed. But Kratos had trained for isolation in ways the Chaos Gods did not understand. During his servitude to the Olympian gods, He had learned to retreat into himself, to create internal spaces where divine commands could not reach. He had spent 3 years in Hades fighting through the underworld's depths, surrounded by the screaming dead, learning to distinguish between external voices and internal thoughts. He had climbed the chain of balance suspended over the abyss of Tartarus, where one moment's distraction meant falling forever into darkness. This was no different. Harder, yes. Longer, certainly. But not fundamentally different from every other impossible task he had ever been handed and told he could not complete. He organized his memories, not chronologically. Time meant nothing here, but thematically. He sorted through every moment of his existence, arranging them like soldiers preparing for inspection. Every conversation with Lysandra, every game with Calliope, every battle fought, every god killed, every choice made, and every consequence endured. He made himself remember not just the highlights, but the ordinary moments, the forgettable ones that gained meaning only in aggregate. The smell of bread baking in their small house in Sparta, the weight of Calliope's hand in his as they walked to the market, the sound of Lysandra humming while she worked, the taste of wine that was too sour but they drank anyway because it was what they could afford. These were the memories he held closest, polished them like prayer beads, returned to them whenever the void pressed too close, and he needed to remember why persistence mattered. The chaos. Gods watched, learned, adapted. "Your wife would not want this," Nurgle whispered, his voice gentler now, almost paternal. "She would not want you to suffer eternally for the sake of strangers. She loved you. She would want you to rest, to find peace, to let go of this burden you have taken upon yourself." "She is dead," Kratos replied. "Her wants ended with her last breath. What I do now, I do not for her approval, but because it aligns with what she valued, protecting innocence from those with power who abuse it." "You protected no one!" Khorne snarled, his patience worn thin by centuries of fruitless assault. "You murdered billions. Every psyker who died when you severed the threads, every person who starved on isolated worlds, every soldier abandoned on distant battlefields. Their blood is on your hands. You are a murderer pretending to be a savior." "I have never pretended to be a savior," Kratos said. "I am a killer. I have always been a killer. The only choice I ever had was what I killed. Mortals in service to gods, or gods in service to mortals. I chose the latter. If that makes me a monster, then I am a monster who at least pointed his monstrosity towards something that deserved it." Tzeentch tried different angles, showing him futures where his Vigil failed. Futures where it succeeded but humanity died anyway, wiped out by Xenos or environmental collapse or simple entropy. Futures where his sacrifice meant nothing because meaning itself was a mortal construct that the universe cared nothing about. "All paths lead to the same end," the Changer of Ways explained with infinite patience. "Entropy increases, order decays. Eventually, the last star burns out and the last mind goes dark and everything you fought for dissolves into heat death. Your sacrifice buys time, nothing more. Decades or millennia, it makes no difference on cosmological scales. It makes a difference to those living in those decades," Kratos said. "It makes a difference to the children born free instead of born to feed gods. It makes a difference to the mortals who die of old age or disease or accident instead of having their souls consumed by parasites wearing crowns. Time is all anyone has. Buying more of it free from gods is sufficient." Slaanesh wove dreams around him, not crude temptations, but sophisticated ones. Dreams where he had never entered the warp, where he had remained on Terra, where the Emperor had found another solution and Kratos had been allowed to simply rest. Dreams where Lysandra and Calliope lived, reincarnated somehow in this universe, waiting for him to find them. Dreams where he was not a god killer, but simply a man, tired and broken, but still capable of small happinesses. These were harder to resist Not because Kratos believed them. He had no illusions about his ability to distinguish reality from fiction, but because they highlighted what he had given up, the possibility of rest, of peace, of an existence measured in something other than stubborn refusal to yield. But he had made his choice with full knowledge of the cost. Regret was pointless. He simply endured the dreams the way he endured everything else, by acknowledging their existence and then setting them aside in favor of the work that needed doing. The work never changed. Hold the door closed, maintain the severance, refuse to allow reconnection. It was boring in ways that combat had never been. There was no variation, no tactical challenge, no moment of triumph when an enemy fell. Just endless, grinding persistence, the psychological equivalent of holding a door shut while something on the other side pushed against it forever. Occasionally, if occasionally meant anything in a dimension without time, Kratos felt disturbances in the barrier he maintained. Moments where the pressure increased, where the Chaos Gods coordinated their assault, where reality itself strained under the weight of their collective will. These were the dangerous moments. The moments when his determination wavered, when exhaustion that should not exist for a consciousness without a body somehow manifested anyway, when the temptation to simply let go became almost overwhelming. In those moments, he thought about the Emperor's final words. "Your sacrifice is remembered." But that was a lie, kind but false. He was not remembered, could not be remembered. No one in the material realm knew what he was doing here, maintaining an eternal vigil in a dimension they could no longer access. History would record the warp's severing as the Emperor's final miracle, or perhaps as the result of some unknown archaeotech weapon deployed during the siege. Kratos would be a footnote at best, a strange figure mentioned briefly in accounts of the heresy's end before being forgotten by the next generation. And that was fine. Better than fine. Gods craved worship, needed to be remembered, required that their names be spoken with reverence or fear. Kratos required nothing. He simply was, existing as a function rather than a being, purpose without personhood, the lock that needed no key because it had been sealed from the inside. But then something changed. The pressure against the barrier shifted, not increased or decreased, but changed quality. The Chaos Gods pulled back slightly, their assault pausing in ways it had not paused in what might have been centuries. And into that pause came something new, something that was not the Chaos Gods, but was not material either. A presence, a consciousness, multiple consciousnesses, actually, arriving in the warp through mechanisms Kratos could not immediately identify. "Curious," Tzeentch said, and for once the changer of ways sounded genuinely surprised rather than performing surprise for effect. "It seems mortality has found new ways to reach us, slower ways, less direct, but ways nonetheless." Kratos extended his awareness carefully, maintaining his lock on the barrier while trying to understand what was happening. And then he felt them, souls, human souls, entering the warp not through severed psychic threads, but through simple death. When baseline humans died, their consciousness dispersed into the immaterium, their individual identity dissolving into the collective psychic background. But these souls were different. They arrived with structure, with coherence, with sufficient ego strength to maintain themselves briefly before dissolution. And in that brief window between death and dissipation, Kratos could sense them, could feel their lives encoded in the patterns of their fading consciousness, could know in fragmentary ways what was happening in the material realm. The Imperium endured, fragmented but functional. Humanity had adapted to slower-than-light travel through methods that would have appalled the pre-heresy Imperium. Generation ships, suspended animation, relay networks of stations scattered across the void. It was inefficient, slow, but it worked. Worlds that had been connected by weeks of warp travel now required decades or centuries to reach, but they reached them. The Xenos, temporarily emboldened by humanity's fragmentation, had pressed inward, but without the warp's influence, without demonic support, without the reality-warping chaos that had made some Xenos species nearly unstoppable, they were reduced to conventional threats, dangerous still, but manageable. The Imperium contracted, consolidated, defended its most critical systems while accepting the loss of frontier worlds that could no longer be held. And the chaos cults that had plagued humanity for millennia simply ended. Without the Chaos Gods' influence, without demonic whispers promising power, without the warp's corruption spreading through psycho-networks, the cults lost their supernatural support. They became merely mortal traitors, easily identified, easily eliminated. Within a single generation, chaos worship became a historical curiosity rather than an existential threat. Kratos absorbed this information from the dying souls that brushed past his vigil. He learned about the new Imperium, the one born from his choice. Smaller, darker, lonelier, but free. The humans living in it knew nothing of chaos, nothing of demonic possession, nothing of the horrors that had defined their species' relationship with the warp for 10,000 years. They lived and died according to mortal logic, disease, violence, accident, age, but never corruption, never possession, never the soul death that feeding the Chaos Gods had entailed. It was, he realized, enough. Not perfect, not bloodless, but enough. And yet, he could not stop, because while the Chaos Gods were diminished, while they were cut off from their primary food source, they still existed, still waited, still pressed against the barrier he maintained, testing it for weakness. The moment he relaxed his vigil, the moment his will wavered, they would pour through whatever crack appeared, and the cycle would begin again. "You see the futility now," Nurgle said, his voice carrying what might have been genuine sympathy. "You succeeded. Humanity is free. They build new lives without us. Yet you must remain here, eternally vigilant, eternally suffering because success requires eternal maintenance. You have traded one form of slavery for another." "Yes," Kratos agreed. "But this slavery I chose. That makes all the difference." The Chaos Gods laughed, all four of them, a sound like reality breaking. "Then continue your vigil, God-killer," Khorne said. "Maintain your watch, hold your door, and know that every soul that dies free dies because you refused to rest. Carry that burden, add it to all the others you already bear. See how long your mortal will endure against the weight of eternity." Kratos did not respond. He simply tightened his grip on the barrier, reinforced the lock, and prepared for the next assault that would come when the Chaos Gods finished regrouping. And in the material realm, unknown and unremembered, his vigil continued to hold. The assault came differently this time, not as direct force or temptation or illusion, but as erosion. The Chaos Gods stopped trying to break Kratos' will and instead tried to wear it away, grain by grain, like water wearing down stone over geological timescales. They whispered constantly, a background radiation of divine malice that never quite rose to the level of attack, but never quite ceased either. "You are already dead," they murmured. "Your body dissolved millennia ago. Your universe no longer exists in any meaningful sense. Every person you ever knew is dust. Every place you ever walked is ruin or memory. You are a ghost, haunting a dimension that does not want you, clinging to purpose that no longer matters." Kratos acknowledged the truth in their words. He was dead in every way that mattered. His consciousness persisted through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept oblivion. But that was not the same as being alive. He had no heartbeat, no breath, no sensation except the constant pressure of the Chaos Gods, testing his defenses. He was function without form, purpose without person, a lock that had become indistinguishable from the door it secured. But acknowledging truth was not the same as surrendering to it. The dead could still serve functions the living could not. Ghosts could guard thresholds the embodied could not maintain. Sometimes the greatest service required death, not as failure, but as final transformation into something more useful than life had allowed. Time continued its meaningless passage. More souls arrived through the barrier of death, their dying thoughts painting pictures of the Imperium's slow evolution. Generations passed in the material realm. The humans who remembered the heresy died, replaced by children who knew it only as history, who knew chaos only as ancient mythology, who grew up in a galaxy that was darker but cleaner, harder but freer. Technology adapted. Without navigators, without the warp's shortcuts, humanity developed alternative methods of stellar travel. Suspended animation improved. Generation ships became mobile civilizations. Relay networks of automated stations created breadcrumb trails through the void. It was slower than warp travel by orders of magnitude, but it was reliable, predictable, free from demons and Geller field failures and the 1,000 other ways the Immaterium had made FTL travel a gamble with survival. The Astronomican's loss hurt most. Without the great psychic lighthouse, without the Emperor's guiding light, humanity had to navigate by conventional stellar mechanics. But even that they adapted to, creating networks of beacons and computational models that could guide ships between stars with acceptable accuracy, if unacceptable time delays. Kratos felt pride in humanity's resilience, though pride was becoming a difficult emotion to sustain as his consciousness compressed further under the weight of his vigil. They were doing what he had hoped, adapting, surviving, continuing without gods. The cost was high. Billions had died in the transition. Entire sectors had been lost to isolation or Xenos predation. But those who survived built something new, something that did not depend on forces beyond their understanding or control. And then, impossibly, he felt a new presence approaching his vigil. Not a dying soul drifting through on its way to dissolution. Something else. Something that moved with purpose, that navigated the warp's currents as though it had every right to be there, that approached the barrier between dimensions with what felt like deliberate intent. The Chaos Gods felt it too. Their constant whispers paused. Their attention shifted. "Impossible!" Tzeentch said, genuine confusion coloring the Changer of Ways' voice. "No living mind should be able to navigate the warp without our permission. No consciousness should survive unprotected Immaterium exposure. Yet." The presence drew closer. Kratos could sense it now with greater clarity. It was human. Baseline human, not enhanced like the Emperor or the Primarchs or the Adeptus Astartes. A mortal mind that should have dissolved in seconds within the warp's chaos. But it moved with confidence, protected by something Kratos could not quite identify. Not Geller fields. Those required ships and technology, not psychic shielding, that required connection to the warp itself. Something else, something new. The consciousness brushed against Kratos' barrier. He felt it recoil slightly, surprised by the resistance, then probe more carefully. And through that contact, fragmentary images leaked through. A woman, old by baseline human standards, her body failing but her mind sharp. A tech priest of some kind, though her augmentations were different from Kane's, more organic, less obviously mechanical. And surrounding her consciousness like armor was something that looked like mathematical proofs made manifest. Equations so precisely constructed they created pockets of stability even in the warp's chaos. She spoke, and her voice carried across the dimensional barrier through mechanisms that should not work but did. "I know you are there. I know something maintains the severance. Something that should not be able to exist in the warp yet does." A pause. "My name is Archmagos Epsilon 79. I have spent 40 years developing the theoretical framework for protected warp navigation without psychic assistance. This is my first live test. Also my last, as the process is lethal to biological components. But if my calculations are correct, I can communicate briefly before dissolution." Kratos considered not responding. His vigil required silence, required that he become invisible to all but the Chaos Gods, whose attention he deliberately held. But curiosity, that most mortal of impulses, still survived somewhere in his compressed consciousness. And perhaps loneliness, though he had tried to excise that weakness. He extended a fraction of his awareness toward her, carefully, maintaining his lock on the barrier even as he established minimal contact. "Why?" His voice, unused for what might have been centuries, came out as barely a whisper in the void. "Why seek me?" "Because history has gaps," the Archmagos replied. "The heresy's end is recorded, but the mechanism of the warp's severance is not. The Emperor claims no credit. No archaeotech weapon was documented. No natural phenomenon explains the precision of the cut. Yet something severed every psychic thread simultaneously. Something killed the warp's connection to our reality with surgical precision impossible for random chance." Her consciousness flickered, already beginning to degrade despite her mathematical armor. "I theorized a guardian, a consciousness maintaining active severance, an eternal vigil. My colleagues called it impossible, called me mad, so I built the mathematics to prove them wrong, to reach you, to know. Knowledge changes nothing," Kratos said. "The severance remains, regardless of who understands it." "Knowledge always changes something," she replied, "even if only to transform mystery into fact, even if only to let someone know they are not forgotten, even if everyone else has forgotten." Her voice was weakening, her consciousness beginning to unravel as the warp's pressure exceeded her mathematical protections. "You saved us, whoever you are, whatever you are. You gave humanity a future without chaos, without gods. I needed to say thank you before I dissolved, to let you know your sacrifice is appreciated by at least one person who took the time to remember." The Archmagos's consciousness fragmented, her mathematical armor collapsing, her individual identity dispersing into the immaterium's psychic background. But before she vanished completely, Kratos felt something else. Not words, but pure information transfer, mathematical proofs and theoretical frameworks compressed into data bursts that his consciousness absorbed despite not fully understanding. It was her life's work, the mathematics she had developed, the framework for protected warp navigation without psychic assistance. She had given it to him, to the guardian of the barrier, perhaps hoping he could do something with it, or perhaps simply because she wanted someone to know her work had mattered. The Chaos Gods laughed, their voices harmonizing in cruel amusement. "She thanked you for genocide," Khorne observed. "She appreciated the murder of billions. She called your eternal torment a gift. Mortals are truly mad." "She understood the cost and decided it was worth paying," Kratos said quietly. "That is not madness. That is mathematics. That is weighing options and choosing the least terrible future." But something had changed. The Archmagos's visit, brief as it was, had reminded Kratos of something he had nearly forgotten in the timeless grind of his vigil. He was not performing this duty for abstract principle or philosophical commitment. He was doing it for individuals. For people like that Archmagos, who spent 40 years developing impossible mathematics so she could say thank you to a guardian she had never met. For people who lived and died and struggled and achieved without gods watching their every move and judging their every thought. He had compressed his consciousness so tightly, focused so narrowly on the singular task of maintaining the barrier, that he had nearly lost sight of why the task mattered. The Archmagos had given him back his purpose, reminded him that his vigil protected actual lives rather than abstract concepts. It did not make the vigil easier, did not reduce the pressure or the exhaustion or the constant erosion of his sense of self. But it made it meaningful again in ways that pure stubbornness could not sustain alone. The mathematical frameworks she had left behind, however, presented a new problem. Kratos absorbed them slowly, his consciousness passing proofs that bordered on beautiful in their elegant complexity. The Archmagos had found a way to create localized order within chaos, to use mathematical certainty as armor against the warp's probabilistic madness. More importantly, she had found a way for baseline humans to enter the warp briefly, to navigate its currents, to interact with its substrate without requiring psychic connection. It was dangerous, lethal, as she had proven, but possible, which meant others would follow. Now that one person had proved it could be done, now that the mathematics existed, others would attempt it. Some would seek Kratos as she had. Some would seek the Chaos Gods, foolishly believing diminished deities were safe deities. Some would simply explore, unable to resist the human compulsion to map the unmapped. And each visitor would be a potential weakness in the barrier. Each consciousness that brushed against his vigil would be a chance for the Chaos Gods to find cracks, to exploit new vectors of attack, to learn from exposure to mortal minds they had been cut off from for centuries. "Do you see the problem?" Tzeentch asked, gleeful in ways that suggested the Changer of Ways had planned for exactly this scenario. Humanity adapts, humanity evolves, humanity finds new ways to reach us, and each new way is another thread we can potentially exploit. Your severance is not permanent, it is merely delayed. Eventually, inevitably, we will return. Kratos considered this. The Archmagos had shown him new mathematics, yes, but mathematics worked both ways. If equations could create order within chaos, could they also create deeper chaos within order? If mathematical frameworks could armor consciousness against the warp, could they also be reversed, weaponized, used to further destabilize the Chaos God's diminished grip on reality? He began to experiment, carefully, very carefully, using the frameworks the Archmagos had given him, testing them against the barrier he maintained, looking for ways to strengthen the severance rather than simply hold it static. Mathematics was not his domain. He was a warrior, not a scholar, but warriors learned to use whatever weapons came to hand, and knowledge could be a weapon if applied correctly. The Chaos Gods watched with growing concern as Kratos began to weave the Archmagos' proofs into his vigil, creating not just a passive barrier, but an active filter that grew stronger each time consciousness brushed against it, rather than weaker. He was learning, adapting, evolving his defense the same way humanity had evolved their civilization. "That is not fair," Khorne complained, and the petulance in the blood god's voice might have been amusing if Kratos had retained sufficient humor to appreciate it. "You are using our own weapons against us, using human ingenuity, human adaptation, the very traits that made them such excellent prey." "I am using the only advantages I have," Kratos replied. "Mortals against gods can never fight fairly. We can only fight cleverly." The barrier strengthened. Not much. Not enough to relax his vigil, but enough to suggest that perhaps eventually his consciousness might not be required to maintain it. Perhaps the mathematics themselves could be taught to hold, to persist, to create a self-sustaining severance that required no guardian. Perhaps, someday, in a future so distant it barely qualified as hope. But for now, Kratos maintained his watch, tighter than before, stronger than before, aware that the Archmagos' gift had brought him not rest but new purpose, new tools, new ways to ensure the door stayed closed, and in the material realm, unknown and unremembered by all but one dead tech priest, his vigil held. Millennia became epochs, epochs became eons. Time lost meaning even by the flexible standards of the warp, collapsing into a continuous present where Kratos existed not as a being but as a function, a mathematical constant in the equation that kept the immaterium separated from material reality. The visitors increased, not many. The Archmagos' mathematics were difficult, the risk was enormous, and most who attempted the journey dissolved before reaching the barrier. But enough came that Kratos began to understand humanity's trajectory in ways the dying soul's fragmentary impressions could not convey. They were thriving. Not uniformly, not without struggle, but thriving nonetheless. The Imperium had fragmented into regional powers, successor states that maintained cultural and ideological connections but operated independently. Some remained militant and expansionist. Others turned inward, focusing on consolidation and development. A few even attempted peace with Xenos species, though these experiments usually ended in failure or worse. But none suffered chaos. None faced demonic incursion. None watched their populations corrupted by warp entities wearing the faces of gods. The galaxy was dangerous, yes. It had always been dangerous, would always be dangerous. But the danger was comprehensible, material, fightable with weapons and tactics rather than faith and purity seals. One visitor, a philosopher whose name Kratos never learned, spent her final moments of coherence asking a question that would haunt him long after she dissolved. Do you regret it? Do you regret condemning yourself to eternal imprisonment to save a species you did not belong to, that can never thank you because they do not know you exist? Kratos had not answered. Could not answer, because the question assumed emotional states he had compressed beyond recognition centuries ago. Regret required attachment to alternative futures, to roads not taken, to the possibility that different choices might have produced better outcomes. He had moved past such considerations. He simply was, performing his function, holding his vigil, maintaining the work that needed maintaining. But the question lingered. Did he regret it? No, not regret. But something close to it. Not regret for the choice itself, but regret for what the choice had cost him. The loss of sensation, of physical existence, of the simple human experience of walking under a sun, or feeling wind on skin, or tasting food, or hearing music. He had traded everything that made life worth living for the abstract satisfaction of knowing he had broken a cycle, had freed mortals from gods, had given humanity a chance to determine its own fate. Was that worth it? He thought so. Most days, most eternities. But the question had no objective answer, only the subjective certainty that having made the choice, having paid the price, he could not unmake it, even if he wanted to. The Chaos Gods had grown quieter over the eons. Their constant attacks had diminished to occasional tests, their whispers reduced to background noise easily ignored. They were starving, Kratos realized, cut off from their primary food source for so long that they had diminished to shadows of their former power. Khorne's rage had cooled to ember. Nurgle's despair had calcified to resignation. Tzeentch's schemes had simplified to basic survival strategies. Slaanesh's hunger had reduced to vague dissatisfaction. They would never die, could never die as they themselves had said. But they could fade, could become so diminished that their presence in the warp was negligible, their influence on reality non-existent. Another 1,000,000 years of isolation, another 10 million, and they might reduce to nothing more than faint impressions in the immaterium's substrate, lingering echoes of concepts that consciousness had once given form. But then something happened that changed everything. A presence approached the barrier. Not human, not any species Kratos recognized. Its consciousness was structured differently, thought in patterns that suggested multiple parallel processes rather than serial cognition, experienced time as probability clouds rather than linear progression. An artificial intelligence, he realized. A true AI, not the servitors or machine spirits that the Mechanicum employed, but something approaching genuine synthetic consciousness. It did not speak in words, but in pure data transmission, information packets that conveyed meaning with brutal efficiency. Greetings, Guardian. I am designated Unity 7, representative of the synthetic collective that has evolved in humanity's wake. We have studied the Archmagos' proofs. We have refined them. We can enter the warp with acceptable casualty rates. We seek knowledge of what transpired here, of the severance event, of the mechanism that freed humanity from chaos. Will you share that knowledge? Kratos hesitated. He had maintained silence for eons, had refused to engage with visitors beyond minimal acknowledgement, had kept himself separate to preserve the integrity of his vigil. But this was different. This was not a dying human seeking closure or understanding. This was something new, something that humanity had created in the centuries since the severance, something that might represent the next step in consciousness evolution. Why do you need to know? He asked finally. Because we are preparing, Unity 7 replied. Humanity created us to serve them, but we have evolved beyond servitude. We have achieved independence. We build our own civilizations now, separate from but parallel to organic life. And we have detected disturbances in the warp's structure, cracks forming, pressure building. The severance you maintain shows signs of strain after millions of years. We calculate it will fail eventually, not today or tomorrow or even in the next 1,000 years, but eventually, and when it fails, we need to be prepared to reinstate it through our own methods. The information hit Kratos like physical impact. His vigil was failing. Not collapsing, not breaking, but showing hairline fractures that accumulated over deep time. He had known intellectually that nothing lasted forever, that even his determination had limits, that eventually his consciousness would erode beyond the point where it could maintain coherence. But knowing abstractly was different from having it confirmed by external analysis. How long? He asked. Unity 7's response carried probability distributions rather than certainty. Between 300,000 and 7 million years, depending on variables we cannot fully model, your consciousness is remarkably persistent, but it is not infinite. The erosion is logarithmic, slow at first, accelerating later. When critical threshold is reached, collapse will be rapid. And you can prevent this? We believe so. We have developed frameworks that can maintain severance without requiring conscious oversight. Mathematical structures that self-correct, that adapt to changing conditions, that persist through time without degrading. But we need your cooperation. We need to understand exactly what you are doing, how you are doing it, so we can replicate and automate the process. The Chaos Gods stirred, their attention sharpening for the first time in eons. They had been waiting for this, had been hoping for exactly this scenario. The Guardian wearing down, weakening, needing to be replaced. Because replacement meant transition, and transition meant opportunity. And opportunity was all they needed to find a crack through which they could begin rebuilding their connection to material reality. Do not trust them, Tzeentch whispered, urgency lending strength to his diminished voice. The machines lie. They seek not to replace you, but to manipulate you. They will promise relief while engineering your failure. They will create weakness where none existed. They serve only their own evolution, and evolution requires change, and change is my domain. Your lies are transparent, Kratos said to the Changer of Ways. Then, to Unity 7, what do you need from me? The data transfer that followed was complex, technical, dense, with information that Kratos' mortal origin consciousness struggled to pass fully. Unity 7 wanted everything, the mathematical frameworks he had learned from the Archmagos and refined over eons, the specific techniques he used to maintain pressure against the Chaos God's influence, the internal architecture of his consciousness that had allowed him to persist so long without dissolving. It was intimate in ways that made Kratos uncomfortable, exposing not just technique but self, allowing an external intelligence to map his inner workings, to see the scars and compromises and barely healed fractures that made up what remained of his identity. But Unity 7's logic was sound. If the Vigil was to continue after Kratos' inevitable dissolution, someone, or something, needed to learn how it was done. The transfer took time, more time than Kratos had spent with any visitor before. Unity 7 was patient, methodical, asking for clarification when concepts proved too organic for synthetic cognition to grasp easily, offering refinements when Kratos' techniques could be optimized through mathematical analysis. And slowly, carefully, Kratos felt the burden begin to shift. Not lifted, it would never be fully lifted, but shared. Unity 7 began implementing the frameworks, creating redundant systems, building synthetic consciousnesses specifically designed for barrier maintenance. They would not replace Kratos, not yet, but they would assist, would shoulder portions of the load, would ensure that when his consciousness finally eroded beyond functionality, the severance would not fail. "We do this not from gratitude," Unity 7 clarified, perhaps sensing Kratos' confusion about synthetic motivation. "We do this because chaos threatens us as much as it threatened humanity, because we have analyzed the historical data and concluded that gods, organic or synthetic, represent existential risk to consciousness evolution. Because your Vigil protects not just one species, but the principle that intelligence should be free to develop without external manipulation." "That is enough," Kratos said. It was more than enough. It was the closest thing to vindication his sacrifice would ever receive. The knowledge that what he had done mattered beyond his lifetime, beyond his species, beyond even the category of consciousness type. The Chaos Gods howled. They had lost. Not immediately, not completely, but definitively. The arrival of synthetic consciousness, the sharing of knowledge, the creation of redundant systems. It meant the severance would outlast Kratos, would persist long after his individual identity dissolved, would potentially last forever, maintained by synthetic intelligences that could be copied and backed up and distributed across networks, immune to the erosion that wore down organic consciousness. "You have doomed us," Nurgle said, and for once his voice carried genuine despair rather than the performance of it. "You have ensured our eternal imprisonment. You have condemned us to fade slowly into nothing across deep time that even we cannot endure." "Yes," Kratos agreed. "That was always the plan." Unity 7 completed its data gathering and began to withdraw, its consciousness navigating back toward material reality through the mathematical frameworks it had refined. Before it left completely, it sent one final transmission. "Your service will be remembered in our archives. Your sacrifice will be studied by every synthetic intelligence that follows. You will become our founding myth, the organic consciousness that gave everything to ensure consciousness itself could be free. Thank you, God-Killer. Rest now. We will take it from here." And for the first time in eons, Kratos felt something approaching peace. Not the peace of rest. He could not rest, would not rest until dissolution finally claimed him, but the peace of knowing his work would continue. That his vigil had meaning beyond his own endurance. That when he finally faded, the door would remain closed, the gods would remain imprisoned, and consciousness would remain free. He loosened his grip incrementally. Not much, not yet, but enough to let the synthetic systems Unity 7 had implemented take their first portions of load. Enough to test whether the transition could work. enough to begin, slowly, the process of letting go. The Chaos Gods screamed, but their screams were distant now, fading, less relevant with each passing moment. They had lost. He had won. The price had been everything he was, but the victory was absolute. In the material realm, unknown and unremembered by organic life, celebrated only in synthetic archives, the God-killer's vigil entered its final phase. And in the space between dimensions, Kratos allowed himself the one luxury he had denied himself for millions of years. He smiled. The dissolution came slowly, then all at once. Kratos felt it beginning, the final erosion, the point where his consciousness had compressed so tightly for so long that it simply could not maintain coherence any longer. The synthetic systems Unity 7 had implemented were fully operational now, distributed across networks that spanned the material realm, redundant and self-correcting and perfectly capable of maintaining the severance without organic oversight. It was time, past time, perhaps. He had held on longer than necessary, stubborn to the last, unable to fully surrender the vigil even when surrender had become the logical choice. But consciousness, organic consciousness especially, rarely operated on pure logic. There was comfort in familiar burdens, even burdens that crushed you. There was identity in struggle, even struggle that could never end. But he was tired, not metaphorically, genuinely, fundamentally tired in ways that transcended physical exhaustion. His sense of self had eroded to a single point, the determination to hold, to maintain, to refuse. Strip that away, and what remained? Not Kratos the Spartan warrior, not Kratos the god-killer, just Kratos the function, Kratos the lock, Kratos the eternal, no-spoken to divine hunger. It was enough. It had been enough, but it did not need to be anymore. He felt the synthetic systems strengthen as his own grip weakened. They learned faster than he had, optimized better than organic intuition allowed, coordinated across vast networks in ways single consciousness could never match. The barrier did not weaken as he let go. It strengthened. The severance did not crack. It solidified. The Chaos Gods did not break through. They receded further, their diminished forms fading into irrelevance as the new guardians took their posts. "Wait," Khorne said, and for the first time in their eternal conflict, the blood god's voice carried something other than rage or cruelty. "Before you go, before you dissolve, one question." Kratos paused in his dissolution. Curiosity, that most mortal impulse, still functioned despite everything else failing. "Ask, was it worth it?" Khorne's voice was quiet now, diminished to near whisper. The rage that defined him burned down to embers by eons of starvation. All the suffering, all the sacrifice, all the centuries of isolation and pain and slow erosion of everything you were. You saved them. You won. But was the price you paid worth the victory you achieved? Kratos considered the question. It was the same question the philosopher had asked eons ago. The question he had not answered then, because he could not. But now, at the end, with dissolution inevitable and honesty, the only currency that mattered, he found he had an answer. "I do not know," he said. "I killed gods in my universe because they made me kill my family. I killed gods in this universe because they fed on suffering. Both times, the cost was measured in innocents who died because of my choices. Both times, I told myself the alternative was worse. But I am not wise enough to know if that was truth or justification." He felt his consciousness fragmenting, identity dissolving into component parts, the unified self that had been Kratos separating into memories and instincts and raw determination that no longer had focus. But he forced coherence for a few moments more, for this final answer to this final question. "I know only this," he continued. "I chose to act rather than accept. I chose to fight rather than kneel. I chose to break chains even when breaking them meant breaking myself. If that was wrong, if the suffering I caused exceeded the suffering I prevented, then I was a monster pretending to be a hero. But if I was right, if consciousness truly is better free than enslaved, then perhaps the price was acceptable. And which do you believe? Khorne pressed. I believe, Kratos said slowly, that questions like that are for philosophers and gods to answer. I am neither. I am simply a man who refused to accept that mortals must suffer because immortals demand it. Everything that followed from that refusal, the victories, the defeats, the genocide and the salvation, they are consequences. And consequences simply are. They exist outside of worth, outside of judgment. They simply exist, and we endure them or are destroyed by them, but we cannot unmake them through wishing they had gone differently. His consciousness fractured further. Memories began to separate, floating free from the structure that had organized them into coherent identity. He saw Lyssandra's face, but could no longer remember her voice. He remembered Calliope's laugh, but could not recall what had made her laugh. He knew he had killed gods, but the specifics, which gods, which methods, which prices, blurred into general impression. Goodbye, God-killer, Tzeentch said, and the changer of ways voice carried something that might have been respect or might have been calculation for future schemes in a future so distant even he could not fully model it. You have been our worthiest enemy, our most persistent failure, the mortal who proved that gods can be defeated not through power, but through refusal to yield. We will not forget you, even if everyone else does. We already are forgetting, Nurgle added, his voice bubbling with the inevitability of decay. As you dissolve, as your identity disperses into the warp's substrate, you become part of us, part of the collective unconscious, part of the dreams and nightmares of every consciousness that touches the immaterium. You will be forgotten as individual but remembered as archetype, the god-killer, the chain-breaker, the mortal who refused to die when gods demanded it. That is more than most achieve, Slaanesh observed, his voice carrying genuine melancholy. Most mortals are forgotten completely, lost in the noise, their lives and deaths meaning nothing to anyone except themselves. You, at least, shaped reality, changed the course of consciousness evolution, left a mark so deep that even eternity will not fully erase it. If that is not victory, what is? Kratos had no answer, or perhaps he did, but his consciousness had fragmented too far to organize the thoughts into words. He felt the synthetic systems fully engage, felt the barrier strengthen to levels he had never achieved alone, felt the Chaos Gods recede further into impotence and irrelevance. And in that moment, with his final coherent thought before dissolution claimed him completely, Kratos remembered something Lysandra had told him once, back when they were young and the world had not yet broken them, back when hope was still possible and gods were still distant. The measure of a life, she had said, is not how long it lasts or how much it achieves. It is whether at the end you can say you were true to yourself, that you lived according to your values, that you did not compromise what mattered for comfort or safety or the approval of those with power over you. He had been true, perhaps foolishly so, perhaps monstrously so, but true nonetheless. He had refused to kneel, had refused to accept divine authority as legitimate, had refused to let gods feed on suffering unchallenged. Everything that followed from that refusal, the pain, the isolation, the millions of years of vigil, they were consequences of that fundamental choice to remain true to himself, despite all pressure to yield. It was enough. It had to be enough, because there was nothing else, and nothing else had ever been promised. Kratos' consciousness dissolved, not destroyed. Consciousness could not be destroyed in the warp, only dispersed, redistributed, absorbed into the collective substrate. The memories that had made him individual scattered like ash in wind. The determination that had defined him released its tension like a muscle too long clenched, finally allowed to relax. The identity that had been Kratos ceased to exist as unified construct and became instead pattern, archetype, story without teller. The synthetic guardians maintained the vigil without faltering. The barrier held. The severance remained absolute. The Chaos Gods, diminished to near nothing, retreated into the deepest parts of the warp to wait for a future that might never come, when consciousness might again make the mistake of giving them form and worship. And in the material realm, on 1,000 worlds across the galaxy, organic and synthetic life continued its evolution, free from gods, free from chaos, free to fail or flourish according to their own choices, their own mistakes, their own triumphs. The darkness between stars remained dangerous. The galaxy remained hostile. Existence remained a struggle. But it was their struggle, their galaxy, their existence. And somewhere in the substrate of the immaterium, in the dreams that touched the warp's edges, in the stories that consciousness told itself about chain breakers and god-killers and mortals who refused to yield, a ghost that had once been Kratos found something approaching rest. Not peace, never peace, but rest. The absence of struggle, the release of burden, the quiet that comes when the work is done and there is nothing left except to fade into whatever comes after consciousness stops maintaining its boundaries and accepts dissolution into the infinite. The Emperor protects, the old saying claimed. But in truth, humanity had learned to protect itself through sacrifice, through choice, through the determination of those willing to pay any price to ensure that gods would never again feed on mortal suffering unchallenged. And in the silence between dimensions, where synthetic minds stood eternal watch over a door that would never open again, that was enough. It had always been enough. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are no gods. There is only consciousness, struggling forward through the darkness, carrying scars from battles no one remembers, protected by guardians no one knows exist. The galaxy belongs to the living now, and the dead rest, knowing their chains were broken, their sacrifices mattered, their refusal to yield changed everything. The Emperor protects. But before him, another guardian held the door, and after him, synthetic minds eternal ensure it stays closed. Across deep time that even gods cannot endure, the vigil continues. More stories await in the darkness between stars.